In 2025, the United States carried out 47 executions. Together, these prisoners spent 1,167 years on death row. We will cover the crimes that put them there, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. The first execution of the year happened on January 31st, 2025. After spending nearly 23 years on death row, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. But what did he do that got him on death row in the first place? On February 17, 2001, Candy Louise Martin's burned body was found in the trunk of her burned car in Dorchester County, South Carolina. The day before, 20-year-old Marion Bowman Jr. saw Candy and asked her to return money he had loaned her. But when she told him to wait while she continued her conversation, he got angry. According to witnesses, he then said, "That bitch will be dead by dark." And that evening, he made good on that promise. Candy picked up Marion and his cousin, James Tywin Gadsden, to go to a party. But Marion asked her to take a detour through a remote area. Here, they got out of the car. Marion then pulled out a gun and shot Candy as she walked ahead. But she didn't die immediately, and she begged him for her life, saying she had a child, but Marion didn't care. He fired twice more, killing her, and then dragged her body into the woods. They took her car and drove back to the city, where he bragged about the murder and tried to sell Candy's car. But nobody wanted to buy the car, so that night, he returned to the woods with his friend, Travis Felder. They pulled Candy's body from the woods, stuffed it in the trunk, and set the car on fire. After that, Travis drove him back to Branchville, and they went home like nothing had happened. But by morning, it was over. Police arrested Marion and found Candy's wristwatch in his pants pocket. Marion was convicted of first-degree murder in 2001 and sentenced to death. Over the years, his appeals focused on claims of ineffective legal representation and mental illness, but each one of them was denied. On January 31, 2025, Marion was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution. In his prepared last words, he said, "I did not kill Candy Martin. I'm innocent of the crimes I'm here to die for. I know that Candy's family is in pain. They are justifiably angry. If my death brings them some relief and ability to focus on the good times and funny stories, then I guess it will have served a purpose. I hope they find peace." If you want to read the full statement, I suggest you pause the video here. For his last meal, he requested a feast: fried shrimp, oysters, fish, chicken wings, chicken tenders, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, pineapple juice, and cranberry juice. He was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. Marion Bowman Jr. was 44 years old. The next execution was scheduled for February 5, 2025. After spending 12 years on death row, Stephen LaWayne Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. But what did he do to end up on death row? On March 3, 2011, Stephen entered North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, intending to rob the place. Inside, he found Pastor Clint Dobson and church secretary Judy Elliott. Stephen attacked them both, strangling Clint with a computer cord and suffocating him with a plastic bag. Judy was brutally beaten, suffering severe injuries to her face, head, and body. After leaving them for dead, Stephen stole Clint's laptop and phone along with Judy's credit cards and car. He later used the credit cards to buy clothes and jewelry and sold the stolen laptop for cash. Police linked Stephen to the crime after finding Clint and Judy's belongings in his possession, along with bloodstains on his shoes that matched both victims. He was arrested after failing to report to his probation officer on the day of the murder. A jury convicted him of capital murder in 2012, sentencing him to death. His appeals, which argued against procedural errors in his trial, were denied. While awaiting trial in jail, Stephen was known for violent outbursts, including breaking prison property and threatening officers. And to make things even worse, in 2012, Stephen was accused of killing fellow inmate Jonathan Holden, a mentally ill prisoner, after allegedly tricking him into a fake suicide attempt. Stephen used a noose made from blankets to strangle Jonathan and reportedly celebrated afterward playing air guitar with a broom. Stephen spent the next 12 years on death row inside Texas's Polunsky unit. He filed appeals at every level, state courts, federal judges, even the U.S. Supreme Court, but all of them failed. When his final day came, Stephen wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and just had what the other inmates were having that day. On February 5, 2025, Stephen lay strapped to the gurney, eyes fixed on a woman he had never touched outside of prison walls. She was his wife, a pen pal he had met 5 years earlier and married just 3 months before. His final words weren't for the victims. They were for her. "I will always love you no matter. Our love is uncontrollable. There is no definition and no felling. I'm thankful and grateful. It is what it is. Always live for me and enjoy life. Give Monkey a hug for me. No, I am not scared. It's cold shit in here. I'm at peace. I'm ready to be at home. Let's ride, Warden." The warden gave the signal, and the injection began to flow. Stephen turned toward the glass, looking at his wife and dog one more time. "Let me go to sleep," he told her. The word love slipped out as his voice faded. His body tensed. He gasped twice and appeared to try to hold his breath. His head, shoulders, and arms trembled for a few seconds before all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead 24 minutes later, at 6:50 p.m. He died just 13 days before his 38th birthday. Just 1 day later, the next execution was scheduled, this time in Alabama. On February 6, 2025, after spending more than 35 years on death row, Demetrius Frazier was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. Let's take a look at the crime he committed. On November 27, 1991, Demetrius broke into the Birmingham apartment of 40-year-old Pauline Brown. Initially, he just wanted money and woke her up demanding cash, but after he forced her to hand over more money, he also actually assaulted her. As soon as Pauline started to plead for her life, Demetrius was done, and he shot her in the back of the head. Before leaving, he searched her apartment for more money, ate some of her food, and got rid of the gun. Her body was found the next day by a concerned friend. The scene was devastating, and no one had any answers. Whoever had done it was gone. But the silence didn't last. A few months later, on March 8, 1992, in Detroit, Demetrius struck again. That day, 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick was found dead inside an abandoned house. The place was gutted, cold, stripped of anything useful, and forgotten by nearly everyone. But that afternoon, Crystal was trapped inside it. She'd run away from home again. And this wasn't the first time. Her life had started falling apart ever since her mother spiraled into addiction and vanished from her world. Friends said Crystal used to be quiet, polite, a good kid. But without anyone steady in her life, she started slipping through the cracks. And that's when she crossed paths with Demetrius Frazier. Inside that abandoned house, Demetrius tried to rape her, but Crystal fought back. She tried to run, but Demetrius pulled a gun and shot her in the head before she could make it to the door. She collapsed on the filthy floor and was gone instantly. Police in Michigan identified him as a suspect almost right away. But at that time, Demetrius was already a wanted man, linked to another brutal case just months earlier. In Alabama, authorities were building a case against him for the rape and murder of Pauline Brown. Then they finally caught up with him, and within hours, the confessions started coming. First, he admitted to killing Crystal. Then he confessed to murdering Pauline too. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Holman Correctional Facility. His final meal was from Taco Bell and included a beefy 5-layer burrito, a chicken chalupa supreme, beef crunchy tacos, chips and dip, and a Mountain Dew. Before the execution, he met with his mother, sister, and legal counsel. When asked for his final words, he simply said, "Detroit strong. I love everyone on death row. Let's go." At 6:36 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Demetrius Terrence Frazier was 52 years old. Just a week later, the next execution was carried out. On February 13, 2025, after spending more than 26 years on death row, James Ford was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? On April 6, 1997, James lured his co-worker and his wife, Greg and Kimberly Malnery, to a fish farm in Charlotte County, Florida, under the pretense of a fishing trip. Once they arrived, James attacked them. He shot Greg in the head, then bludgeoned and slit his throat. Kimberly managed to secure their 2-year-old daughter in the backseat of their truck before trying to flee, but James caught her, sexually assaulted her, and then brutally took her life with a rifle. This all happened while her daughter was watching. The following day, farm workers found the couple's bodies, and their daughter was discovered alive in the truck, dehydrated and covered in her mother's blood. She was taken to a hospital and survived. James was arrested almost 2 weeks later, on April 17, 1997, after investigators linked him to the crime. He initially claimed he had left the couple at the farm to go hunting alone, but his story was inconsistent, and multiple witnesses confirmed he was with them before their deaths. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, sexual battery, and child abuse. In May 1997, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, and he was sentenced in February 1999. James tried to appeal the death sentence, but these were denied. His execution was scheduled for February 13th at Florida State Prison. That day, he woke up at 3:30 a.m. and met with 3 family members and his legal team one last time. For his final meal, he requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. When the warden asked if he had any last words, James didn't say a thing. Strapped to the gurney with around 25 witnesses watching, he stared ahead in silence. But earlier, he had left behind a short handwritten note. Hugs, prayers, love. God bless everyone. At first, as the injection began, his chest began heaving, and then slowly all movements faded. A few minutes later, a staffer shook him and yelled, "Ford! Ford!" to see if he was still conscious. But there was no response. At 6:19 p.m., James was pronounced dead. James Dennis Ford was 64 years old. At that exact moment, another execution was unfolding. A different state, but the same final outcome. Richard Tabler had spent almost 20 years on death row, and the story that led him there was horrifying. For most people, this story starts on Thanksgiving Day in Killeen, Texas. But for Richard Tabler, it began a week earlier, on November 18, 2004. On that day, Richard, who was 25 at the time, had a falling out with his former boss, Mohammed Amina Ramouni, the manager of a local strip club called Teasers. And things escalated fast. Richard claimed Mohammed threatened his family, and that was the last straw. From that moment on, he was planning revenge. Between November 26 and 28, 2004, Richard committed 4 murders in Killeen, Texas. He first shot and killed nightclub manager Mohammed and his friend Hytham Frank Zayed. And 2 days later, he lured 16-year-old Amanda Benefield and 18-year-old Tiffany Dotson to a lake where he shot them multiple times. Richard later called the police to taunt them and threatened further killings if the nightclub was not shut down. Richard was arrested on November 28, 2004, for unrelated charges, but quickly became a suspect in the murders. He confessed while in custody and was charged with capital murder. He was sentenced to death in 2007. On February 14, 2025, just 8 days after his 46th birthday, Richard was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal and ate off the menu. In his final statement, he addressed the families of his victims, saying, "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask and pray, hope and pray, that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me for those actions. No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you." He also thanked his family, legal team, and prison staff for their support. If you want to read his full statement, I suggest you pause the video here. After apologizing several more times and saying this was the beginning of a new life for him in heaven, he told the warden, "I am finished." As the drugs began to flow, he mouthed once again, "I'm sorry," then began breathing quickly. After about a dozen breaths, all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. Richard Lee Tabler was 46 years old. On March 7, 2025, after more than 20 years on death row, Brad Keith Sigmon was executed by firing squad. But to understand how he ended up strapped to a chair with a hood over his head, we have to go back, way back. On April 27, 2001, Brad murdered his ex-girlfriend's parents, David and Gladys Lark, in Taylor, South Carolina. After his 3-year relationship with Rebecca Barberi ended, Brad became obsessed, stalking her and trying to win her back. The night before the murders, he consumed alcohol and cocaine, and the next morning, he told a friend he planned to tie up Rebecca's parents and confront her, but his friend backed out. Brad entered the Larks' home alone and attacked them with a baseball bat, repeatedly striking their heads until their skulls were crushed. He then stole a gun and waited for Rebecca to return. When she arrived, Brad forced her into a car at gunpoint. He intended to take her to North Carolina, but she escaped by jumping out and running. Brad fired at her but missed. After she got away, he fled the scene. 11 days later, Brad was captured in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and extradited to South Carolina. The jury sentenced him to death, rejecting his defense's argument that his drug use and emotional distress warranted leniency. His appeals were repeatedly denied, with his final appeal rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2021. Then, on March 7, 2025, the moment finally came. For his final meal, Brad requested 4 pieces of fried chicken from KFC with green beans, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cheesecake, and a sweet tea. He asked for enough to share with other inmates, but reports varied as to whether this request was granted. At 6 p.m., Brad was strapped into the execution chair inside the Broad River Correctional Institution. He said he wanted his final statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty, he said. At that time, I was too ignorant to know how wrong that was. Why? Because we no longer live under the Old Testament law, but now live under the New Testament. He then quoted several Bible passages that emphasize forgiveness and the law. Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man the authority to kill another man, he said. After his final statement, a hood was placed over his head and a target strapped over his heart. He made several heavy breaths during the 2 minutes from when the hood was placed over his head to the shots being fired. The execution was carried out by a firing squad armed with rifles loaded with .308 Winchester rounds, ammunition known for its devastating impact, and they are designed to fragment on contact. A direct hit to the heart could end a life in seconds. The curtains opened at 6:01 p.m., and at 6:05, the trio fired from 15 feet away without any warning. Just before the rifles cracked, some believed he mouthed the words, "I'm okay," to his attorney. Then came the shots. His arms jerked tight the moment the bullets hit, and the paper target snapped clean off his chest. For a second, it looked like he was still breathing, 1, maybe 2 shallow pulls of air, while a dark red bloom spread beneath the wound. His chest shifted slightly. Then, everything went still. About a minute later, a doctor stepped forward, leaned in, and checked for signs of life. 90 seconds passed before he looked up, and at 6:08 p.m., he gave the word. Brad Keith Sigmon was pronounced dead. Brad was 67 years old, the oldest person executed in South Carolina since the death penalty returned. The next execution was scheduled for March 18th. After spending 26 years on death row, Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr. was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Louisiana, a method never before used in the state. But before we discuss his final moments, let's go back to Thanksgiving morning, November 28, 1996, when a duck hunter made a horrifying discovery in St. Tammany Parish. Lying on a makeshift dock near the Middle Pearl River was the naked body of a young woman who had been shot in the head. Later that day, her husband identified her as Mary Molly Elliott, a 28-year-old advertising executive. He had reported her missing the night before when she never came home from work, and he had spent hours calling, searching, and hoping for any news. But this was the worst possible outcome. That night, police reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby ATM, and they found Mary on camera. She was visibly terrified, and it looked like she was forced to withdraw cash. Standing beside her was an 18-year-old valet who was later identified as Jessie Hoffman. When officers brought him in, he first lied about what happened, and then he changed his story, but eventually he confessed. He said that he had kidnapped Mary at gunpoint, drove her across parish lines, and assaulted her. Then, at the edge of the Middle Pearl River, he made her kneel and shot her in the head. Mary died alone in the cold, and Jessie just went back to work like nothing had happened. On September 11, 1998, the jury found Jessie guilty of first-degree murder, and just 2 days later, they delivered their final decision, a unanimous death sentence. On March 18, 2025, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. became the first person in Louisiana executed in over 15 years. Before his execution, he didn't say a word. No final statement, no apology. He also turned down the option of a special last meal, choosing instead to face death without ceremony. Among the witnesses that day was Jesse's wife, Ilona. She had married him while he was already behind bars, standing by him through years of confinement. To her, the system had failed Jesse long before it ever sentenced him to die. As a child, he was left without the safety or guidance every kid deserves. And when he needed help the most, no one showed up. And that silence pushed him down a path where surviving came first and everything else came second. At 6:12 p.m., officers escorted Jesse into the execution chamber. This was Louisiana's first time using nitrogen gas, and the process lasted nearly 19 minutes. Witnesses said Jesse instantly began twitching. His head jerked and his hands clenched, but then fell still. A state official later confirmed the motion, but emphasized that the execution went mostly as expected. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. Jesse was 46 years old. But not every death row inmate fears the end. Some, like the next man, demand it. On March 19, 2025, after spending 17 years on death row, Aaron Brian Gunches was executed in Arizona. But what did he do? It all started in November 2002, when Mesa police got a tip about a body in the desert. It was Ted Price, shot and dumped under the Arizona sun. But how did he end up there? Days earlier, Ted had been staying at his ex-wife Catherine's place, hoping to get back on his feet. But the peace didn't last. They fought a lot, and eventually she once hit him in the face with a phone. Something in Ted shut down. He didn't fight back. He just stood there, dazed, slow, out of it. And that night, Catherine's new boyfriend, Aaron Gunches, walked through the door. Instead of calling 911 or getting help, Aaron told Catherine and her two roommates to put Ted in the car. He claimed he'd take him to the bus station, get him out of town. Ted sat in the back, silent. They wanted to believe he'd be okay, but they didn't ask questions. At the station, Aaron realized he had no money for a ticket, so he had to come up with a different plan. He told Jennifer to keep driving, farther, out past the city, down a dirt road, empty and dark. Then the shots came fast, 3, then one more. When it was over, Ted was face down in the dust, dead. But the truth unraveled fast. Catherine and her roommates talked, and Aaron was arrested. In 2004, he pled guilty to murdering Ted. He offered no defense, and in 2008, the state gave him death. While most death row inmates spend years fighting to escape execution, Aaron did the opposite. In November 2022, after spending 14 years awaiting execution, he asked the Arizona Supreme Court to issue his execution warrant. He claimed he didn't want delays, saying he wanted justice to be served. Aaron had grown tired of the delays, and once again he demanded to be executed, making it clear that he wanted no more legal obstacles. This time, the state didn't hesitate. The Arizona Supreme Court set March 19th as his official execution date, and there would be no last-minute changes. His final meal consisted of onion rings, a spicy gyro, a barbecue gyro, baklava, and a double Western bacon cheeseburger with fries. He refused to speak any final words. At 53 years old, Aaron Brian Gunches was dead. Just one day later, the next execution was scheduled. On March 20th, 2025, after spending 20 years on death row, Wendell Arden Grissom was executed by lethal injection. But what did he do to end up there? On November 2nd, 2005, Wendell Grissom left Arkansas with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded gun, and somewhere near the Oklahoma line, he picked up a hitchhiker, Jesse Johns, a stranger with no place to go. But by the time they reached Oklahoma City, they weren't just drinking anymore, they were planning. Wendell had a pistol, a spare Derringer, and an idea: robbery. Driving through Blaine County, Wendell spotted a quiet house near Hitchcock and pulled into the driveway. Inside were two women, Lauren Kopf and her best friend Amber Matthews, and Lauren's two small children. Wendell didn't hesitate after they opened the door. He immediately pulled his gun and opened fire. Amber grabbed the baby and tried to run. Lauren fought back, begging Wendell to stop, but instead of listening, he laughed. Then he shot her in the hand, the hip, and the head, then kept shooting. She collapsed, bleeding, but she was alive. But Wendell wasn't done yet. He stalked the house and started shooting at Amber. Somehow Lauren managed to get away, and when she reached the road, she flagged down a passing trucker and gasped, "My friend and my kids are dead." The police rushed to the home and found both children alive. Amber was still breathing when they found her, but she died later at the hospital. Wendell and Jessie were arrested soon after. The trial didn't take long, since the evidence was overwhelming. And in 2006, Wendell Grissom was sentenced to death. Jesse Johns was sentenced to life in prison and remains locked up to this day. Wendell's execution was set for March 20th, 2025. His final meal consisted of a Canadian Bacon Supreme Pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a pint of Coca-Cola. In his final statement, he asked for forgiveness from the family of the woman he murdered. "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt." At 10:13 a.m., Wendell was pronounced dead. He was 56 years old. Just hours later, another man was preparing for his final walk, this time in Florida. On March 20th, 2025, Edward Thomas James was executed by lethal injection after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. But what did he do? On the night of September 19th, 1993, Eddie showed up at a house party just 2 blocks from where he was staying. He drank, laughed, and blended in like nothing was wrong. And by 10:30 p.m., he was clearly drunk. After most of the guests had gone home, he refused a ride and told everyone he was fine. But he wasn't. Before he went home, he used 10 hits of LSD. Then he kept moving, and by the time Eddie walked through Betty Dick's front door, something in him had already turned. Betty was his mother figure and his landlord, and inside the house, she and 4 of her grandchildren were sound asleep. After he stepped inside, he wrapped his hands around Toni Neuner's neck and squeezed. Eventually, he let go, thinking she was dead. He then dragged her to his room, undressed her, assaulted her, and pushed her between the bed and the wall. Toni didn't scream. She never woke up, and she slowly suffocated. But still, Eddie wasn't finished. He burst into Betty's bedroom and hit her with a candlestick. She woke up and screamed, "Why, Eddie, why?" But he kept hitting her. 9-year-old Wendy woke up and ran in, only to see her grandmother being stabbed. When he was done, he took a shower, packed his bags, and stole Betty's purse, jewelry, and car. And by the time police found the bodies, Eddie was gone. For nearly 3 weeks, he stayed on the run until a viewer of America's Most Wanted spotted him in Bakersfield, California. He was arrested on the spot, and on August 18, 1995, Eddie was sentenced to death. On March 20, 2025, inside Florida State Prison, the state carried out his execution. Eddie had no visitors on the last day of his life and gave no final statement. His last meal was fried catfish, potato salad, hush puppies, cookies, soda, and coffee. He died at 8:15 p.m. At 63 years old, Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead. The next execution took place in April. On April 8, 2025, Michael A. Tanzi was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison after spending more than 25 years on death row. Let's take a look at what he did to end up there. On April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta parked her maroon van at a quiet Japanese garden in Miami. She was on her lunch break, looking for peace. She had a book in her lap, and the window was rolled down, just a moment to herself. But what she didn't know was that Michael was watching. He was broke, stranded, and angry, desperate for a ride back to Key West. Initially, he asked her for a cigarette, but when she turned to answer him, he punched her in the face and shoved his way into the van. Holding a razor blade, he forced her to drive. South, farther from help, farther from home. By the time they reached Homestead, he had tied her up, stuffed a towel in her mouth, and whispered in her ear that if she screamed, he'd slice her throat. He emptied her wallet, $53, and used it to buy cigarettes and a drink. Then, in a parking lot, he assaulted her with a blade to her throat. By sunset, they reached Blimp Road, a secluded and silent spot, and there he told her that she wasn't going home. He looped a rope around her neck and pulled, and when her gasps grew too loud, he taped her mouth, her nose, and even her eyes. Then he pulled again, harder, until her body stopped moving. But police were already tracking her ATM withdrawals, and just 2 days later, they arrested him as he returned to Janet's van. Eventually, Michael Tanzi pleaded guilty to every charge, including first-degree murder, and in February 2003, he was sentenced to death. On April 8, 2025, Michael Tanzi was strapped to a gurney inside Florida State Prison. According to prison officials, he woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had one visitor, a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, Michael requested a pork chop, bacon, corn, ice cream, and a candy bar. When asked if he had any final words, Michael spoke in a barely audible voice. He said, "I want to apologize to the family," and then recited a verse from the Bible before the drugs began flowing. Once the 3-drug protocol began, his chest rose and fell for about 3 minutes, then stopped. A corrections officer shook him by the shoulders and called his name twice to check for consciousness. He did not respond. After almost 25 years on death row, Michael A. Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. He was 48 years old. 3 days later, the next execution was scheduled, this time in South Carolina. After 18 years on death row, Mikal Mahdi was executed by firing squad. But what did he do? On July 14, 2004, 21-year-old Mikal stole a pistol from his neighbor's home in Virginia. He also took a station wagon and license plates. He was heading south, and he didn't want to be followed. The next night in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he walked into a convenience store with a can of beer. Behind the counter was 29-year-old Christopher Boggs. When Christopher asked for ID, Mikal pulled the gun and shot him in the face. As Christopher collapsed, Mikal stepped forward and fired again, point blank. Then he walked out, calm, unbothered, and headed south toward South Carolina. And just 3 days later, he struck again. This time, it was a farm outside Columbia. Mikal had already ditched one car and stolen another. He broke into a home and waited, flipping through TV channels, surrounded by tools and weapons, unaware that the land he was hiding on belonged to a police captain. James Myers had spent the day celebrating birthdays with his wife and 5 kids, but when he came home, he walked straight into an ambush. Mikal had grabbed a rifle from the shed and fired. 9 rounds in total, of which 3 hit James in the head, and 1 more tore through his heart. Then Mikal poured diesel on the body and lit it on fire. He stole the captain's truck, his shotgun, and his badge-issued rifle, and drove off like nothing happened. On July 21st, police found him behind the wheel of the stolen truck, and he was arrested. His defense pointed to a broken past, abandonment, mental illness, juvenile institutions. But the jury wasn't swayed. On December 8, 2006, Mikal Mahdi was sentenced to death. On April 11, 2025, Mikal chose a last meal of ribeye steak cooked medium, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Then Mikal was placed in a chair, a target pinned to his chest, and a black cap covering his head at 6:01 p.m. Mikal gave no final statement, didn't speak, and never looked at the witnesses, including his own lawyer, who were seated just feet away. The state's firing squad protocol called for 3 prison staff to fire simultaneously, aiming at a bullseye target on Mahdi's chest. What followed was described by those in the room as both shocking and deeply disturbing. Mahdi let out a sharp yell that cut through the silence. One witness said it felt like a deep heave, as if his chest expanded hard, then collapsed. His arms flexed, and he groaned twice, about 45 seconds after the bullets hit. Witnesses reported that he continued to breathe for another 80 seconds, taking what appeared to be a final gasp before going still. A prison doctor stepped forward and pronounced him dead at 6:05 p.m., less than 4 minutes after he was shot. At 42 years old, Mikal Dean Mahdi was dead. By the time he died, Mikal had spent 68% of his life either in juvenile or adult prison. The next execution was scheduled 12 days later, this time in Texas. Let's take a look. On April 23, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was executed by lethal injection in Texas. But before we discuss his final moments, let's go back to where it all began. On March 18, 2004, 20-year-old Rachel Tollison wasn't answering her door. Her purse was still on the table, her car was parked outside, but her house was a wreck, and her 5-month-old baby was found crying alone on a flipped-over bed. But Rachel was gone. Her mother had stopped by like she always did, but this time there was no sign of Rachel. And then, 6 days later, a hiker found something in the woods, a pile of logs, and beneath them, Rachel's body. She'd been strangled, stabbed, and eventually set on fire. Detectives looked at her estranged husband first. They had a messy divorce, and he had been at a bonfire the night she disappeared. The same mesquite wood burned at that party matched the logs found with her body, right down to the chemical trace. But then a new name surfaced, Moises Mendoza. He was the one who brought the firewood, and he knew Rachel from high school. They spoke at the party, but she wasn't interested in him. When questioned, he told the police that she left with him willingly. But no one believed that. Later, his story changed. He admitted he choked her in his truck, assaulted her in a field, strangled her once, then again and again. When he thought she was dead, he stabbed her in the throat to make sure. But as the police closed in, he panicked. He dragged her body to a remote pit in Collin County, lit her on fire, and buried what was left beneath a brush pile. He thought no one would ever find her. At trial, there was no debate about guilt, and it took the jury just 4 hours to come up with a sentence. On July 3, 2005, Moises Mendoza was sentenced to death. On April 23, 2025, after spending over 2 decades on death row, Moises was finally executed. He wasn't allowed to choose a last meal. Texas removed that option in 2011 after 2 inmates ordered a massive feast and refused to eat it. Now they received the same food as everyone else. After he was strapped to the gurney, his spiritual advisor prayed over him for about 2 minutes. Then Moises turned to the victim's family. One by one, he addressed them by name. Rochelle's parents, her 2 brothers, her cousin, and her uncle, all watching through a window from the adjoining room. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life," he said. He also said he had robbed Rochelle's daughter of her mother, adding, "I'm sorry for that. I know nothing I could ever say or do would ever make up for it. I want you to know that I am sincere. I apologize." Her daughter wasn't present, but his words were directed to her anyway. Then, turning toward another window, he spoke in Spanish to his wife, sister, and 2 friends who sat watching. "I love you, I am with you, I am well and at peace," he said. "You know that I'm well, and everything is love." At 6:21 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Moises let out 2 loud gasps, then began to snore. After about 10 snores, his body fell still. He was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. At 41 years old, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was dead. Just 1 day later, James Osgood was executed by lethal injection after spending more than a decade on death row. But to understand how James ended up on death row in the first place, we need to go back to October 2010, when everything started. On October 13, 2010, Tracy Brown didn't show up for work, and when calls and texts went unanswered, her boss asked for a welfare check. Her landlord opened the door and immediately froze. Tracy was lying naked on the bedroom floor, her throat slit so deep it left no doubt. This wasn't a suicide. It was a brutal, deliberate murder. Detectives quickly pieced together her final day. Tracy had spent it with 2 people, her cousin, Tanya Van Dyke, and Tanya's boyfriend, James Osgood. A gun was found in their home, and James admitted it was theirs. Later, detectives noticed a fresh cut on his finger, consistent with knife injuries from stab wounds. Eventually, James broke. He said that he and Tanya had fantasized about violence. They watched crime shows and talked about torturing someone. At first, they imagined a stranger, but instead, they chose someone they knew. They chose Tracy. James choked her from behind. Then they dragged her to the bedroom. Here, James forced Tracy to perform acts while Tanya held a gun. And when Tracy tried to run, James dragged her back by her hair. Then he pulled a knife from his sock, slashed her throat, and stabbed her in the back. He then just kept cutting her, and as she bled out, he whispered, "It's nothing against you. Just stop fighting. Let go." Tanya took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty in order to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison instead. She remains incarcerated to this day. James was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, one for one for On June 13, 2014, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On Thursday, April 24, 2025, his final day came. He ate breakfast and snacks, but refused lunch. For his final meal, he requested pizza. At 6:09 p.m., the curtain to the execution viewing room opened. James was already strapped to the gurney. At 6:11, he spoke his final words. "I have not said her name since that day. Tracy, I apologize." Then he turned to the people watching, his loved ones, and offered them quiet gestures. At 6:12, he sat upright and made hand signs, 143, code for "I love you." At 6:15, he laid his head down. He took slow, deep breaths as the drugs entered his system. And just moments later, a guard performed the routine consciousness check, calling his name, pinching his arm, flicking his eyelid. James did not respond. By 6:18, his breathing stopped, and at 6:35 p.m., James Osgood was pronounced dead. He was 55 years old. The next execution took place in May. On May 1, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Geoffrey Glenn Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? On the night of September 11, 1998, in a quiet neighborhood in Crestview, Florida, 4 lives were wiped out in just minutes. Inside a modest home, a woman and her 3 children were shot in the head, execution style. There was no struggle, no warning, and no mercy. And the killer wasn't a stranger. It was Geoffrey Hutchinson, a former Army Ranger Gulf War veteran, and the man who lived with them. He was Renee Flaherty's boyfriend, the same guy who helped her raise her kids, Geoffrey, Amanda, and Logan. They trusted him, and then one night he murdered them. Earlier that evening, nothing seemed off, until Geoffrey and Renee got into a fight, a bad one. Afterward, Geoffrey had packed some things, grabbed his guns, and left. Renee thought it was over, but it wasn't. Geoffrey went to a nearby bar and started drinking, ranting to the bartender about needing to cool off. But instead, he got back in his truck with his shotgun beside him and drove home. He shot Renee first, one round to the head. Then he moved through the house like a soldier clearing rooms, and he killed everyone inside. Then, like it was routine, Geoffrey called 911. "I just shot my family," he said, and he was arrested on the scene. At trial, the jury didn't see a man broken by war. They saw a man who picked up a gun and killed the people who loved him. And in 2001, they found him guilty of all 4 murders and sentenced him to death. Geoffrey's execution was scheduled for May 1st, 2025. For his final meal, he requested salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea. He had 3 visitors that day, including his sister and a spiritual advisor. That evening, he was led into the death chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. But as the process began, witnesses saw his lips move, soft, almost inaudible, as if he were talking to himself or whispering a prayer. The state chose lethal injection as the method to execute him. His legs shook sporadically, and he seemed to have body spasms for several minutes before falling still. The process took a little more than 15 minutes. He was declared dead at 8:15 p.m. Geoffrey Hutchinson was 62 years old. 2 weeks later, the next scheduled execution drew far more attention. This time, it was in Florida, and the man at the center of it was serial killer Glen Rogers. Known as the Casanova Killer or the cross-country killer, Glen targeted women who trusted him, mostly redheads like his mother. His first victim was 71-year-old Mark Peters in Ohio, an elderly man who offered him a place to stay when no one else did, but ended up bound and left to rot in a Kentucky cabin. Then it went fast. He first targeted Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3 in California. She was strangled and set on fire in her truck. His next victim was Linda Price in Mississippi, who was found stabbed to death and left in a blood-smeared bathtub. Then came Tina Marie Cribbs in Florida. She was found dead in a motel room after offering Glen a ride. And eventually, Andy Sutton in Louisiana, butchered in her own bedroom after inviting him back into her life. Each murder was personal, brutal, and calculated. And by the time Glen was caught, he was likely already on his way to kill again. He thought he was careful by moving states after each murder. But his trail was longer and bloodier than he realized, and eventually states started talking to each other. By late 1995, America's Most Wanted aired his face. Papers ran his photo nationwide, and detectives began showing up at carnivals, asking workers if they'd seen him. And on November 9th, his run was over. In 1997, he stood trial for Tina Marie Cribbs's murder in Florida, and the jury sentenced him to death. 2 years later, California convicted him for the murder of Sandra Gallagher, and here he received another death sentence. With that, Glen Rogers became one of the rare inmates facing execution in 2 different states. But Glen had more to say. He said he was the one who killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and that O.J. Simpson had hired him to do it. But no one believed him. On May 15, 2025, after spending 28 years on death row, Glen Rogers was executed. That morning, Glen woke up at 3:45 a.m. For his final meal, he requested a pizza, chocolate cake, and a soda. He also had one last visit from his wife. I have looked into this, but further details about his wife and their relationship aren't available in any public records. Later that day, he was strapped to the gurney. When asked for any last words, Glen looked toward the witnesses and spoke directly to those he loved, his wife his brothers, his sons, his grandchildren, and a close friend who had helped with his final appeals. Then, turning to the victims' families, he said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure," he said. "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." Then the drugs began to flow. Glen lay still as the lethal injection started. Within 2 minutes, his eyes closed and his mouth fell open. As the process continued, his face slowly turned pale. At one point, a staff member grasped him by the shoulders, shook him, and yelled, "Rogers, Rogers," checking for any sign of consciousness. There was none. Glen Rogers was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. He was 62 years old. Just 5 days later, another execution followed, this time in Indiana. After nearly 23 years on death row, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie faced the same fate. But to understand what got him on death row in the first place, we need to go back to where it all started. On September 29, 2000, in Beech Grove, Indiana, a white van was reported stolen from a gas station. Not long after, Officer Matthew Hickey spotted it cruising past the scene of a traffic stop with 3 men inside. And just like that, the chase began. 2 more officers joined in, Robert Mercury and William Bill Toney, and the van didn't get far. It crashed into a yard and the doors flew open. One suspect was caught immediately. The second, 20-year-old Benjamin Ritchie, ran. Bill immediately chased him across backyards, fences, and swing sets until Benjamin turned, pulled a 9mm Glock, and fired 5 shots. 1 bullet hit Bill above his vest. He fired back once, then collapsed in the grass. He died there in that backyard, just 1 day before his 32nd birthday. After the shooting, Benjamin vanished. He tossed the gun and a wig into a nearby brush and slipped past the perimeter. And by the time officers locked the area down, he was already hiding in a friend's home. Then, an anonymous tip came in. Officers surrounded the house and found Benjamin inside. This time, he didn't run. He didn't speak. And he didn't resist. He was arrested on the spot, along with Mikal Mahdi, the third man from the van. On August 14th, the jury came back with their decision. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Benjamin would be sentenced to death. Indiana's death row is a little different. As you can see here, Benjamin had a real cat walking inside his cell. And that's not a figure of speech. Death row inmates in Indiana are actually allowed to keep cats as pets. Why? It's part of a program aimed at reducing isolation and improving behavior. And then came the date, May 20th, 2025, nearly 23 years after he first entered death row. At 44 years old, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. For his last meal, Benjamin chose the tour of Italy from Olive Garden, a plate of chicken parmigiana, lasagna, and fettuccine alfredo. Just after midnight, the execution process began. His final words were simple: "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." At 12:46 a.m., Benjamin was pronounced dead. On the same day, May 20th, 2025, Matthew Lee Johnson was executed by lethal injection, exactly 13 years after he committed a brutal crime. But what did he do to end up on death row? On the morning of May 20th, 2012, Matthew walked into the Whip-In convenience store in Garland, Texas, carrying a plastic bottle of lighter fluid and a cigarette lighter in his pocket. He walked straight past the snacks and sodas toward the register, where 76-year-old clerk Nancy Harris told him he wasn't allowed back there. But Matthew didn't stop. He poured the fluid over her head and demanded cash. He took cigarettes, grabbed what little money was in the drawer, and even stole her ring. Then, with nothing left to gain, he flicked the lighter. The flame caught instantly, and Nancy's clothes ignited. But Matthew didn't try to help. He walked out calm, even stopped to grab a piece of candy near the door. Then he disappeared, while Nancy was burning alive. When she made it outside, her whole body was engulfed. 2 nearby officers saw the smoke and rushed in. One grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed her down, while the other tried to keep her talking. In a whisper, Nancy gave them everything she could: what happened, who did it, and what he looked like. Despite severe burns over nearly half her body, Nancy survived long enough to tell paramedics she didn't want to keep fighting. Her living will was honored, and 5 days later, she died in the hospital. Matthew had been arrested just hours after the attack. He was found with her ring and stolen cash still in his pockets. He confessed immediately, claiming he only meant to scare her. But no one believed it, and the surveillance footage was clear. The fire, the robbery, the walkout, there was no panic, no hesitation. At trial, Matthew didn't deny it. He told the jury he was scum, said he deserved to be set on fire like Nancy, but then he asked them not to kill him, not for his sake, but for his daughters. He said he didn't want them growing up knowing their father had been executed. The jury listened and still sentenced him to death. Because by then, they knew this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the final chapter in a long history of violence. And then came the date, May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day since Nancy Harris was set on fire. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal, so Matthew was served the same standard tray as everyone else. When asked if he had any last words, Matthew turned to the victim's family and spoke. "To Mrs. Harris's family, as I look at each and every one of you, I see her on that day," he said. "I just please ask for y'all's forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her. I pray that she's the first person that I see when I open my eyes, and I will spend eternity with her." He continued, praised God, and thanked him for the life he has given me. Then he addressed the men he had spent years with on death row, calling them brothers, and told them he loved them. He also thanked the prison staff for treating him with dignity, for giving him, in his words, the opportunity to get in right standings with my Lord. Then came his apology to his wife and daughters. "Just know that it's nothing that y'all did. I made wrong choices, I've made wrong decisions, and now I pay the consequences." He ended with a prayer of gratitude. "I thank the Lord for the last 13 years. He has given me the opportunity to ask for His forgiveness, and I thank Him for His redemption," he said. "Welcome me, Father. Thank each and every one of you for being here. I'm done, Warden." Matthew received a lethal injection shortly after 6 p.m. inside the Huntsville unit. He gasped several times, then began making low, snoring-like sounds. Within a minute, all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:53 p.m. Matthew Lee Johnson was 49 years old. The next execution was set for just 2 days later, this time in Tennessee. On May 22, 2025, after almost 35 years on death row, Oscar Franklin Smith was executed by lethal injection in Tennessee. Let's go back and look at how this case unfolded. It was just after 11:20 p.m. on October 1, 1989, when a terrified 911 call came into Nashville Dispatch. "Help me," pleaded Jason Burnett. In the background, his brother screamed, "Frank, no! God help me!" Then came silence. Jason managed to get out one last thing, 324 Lutie Street. And then the line went dead. Officers responded within minutes, but when no one answered the door and nothing seemed out of place, they left. But inside, the horror waited. The next afternoon, police returned after a neighbor called in. This time, they went inside and found 3 bodies: Judy Smith and her sons, Chad and Jason. Blood soaked the kitchen and the furniture was overturned. Chad had been shot 3 times and stabbed repeatedly. Judy had been shot, stabbed, and slashed. Jason hadn't been shot, but he was stabbed so violently his internal organs were exposed. All 3 had fought for their lives, but none of them made it. There was no sign of forced entry, but the back door was open. Bullet holes marked the walls. A .22 caliber casing was found near the den, and blood trails stretched from room to room. The gun and knife were gone, but one weapon had been left behind, a blood-covered awl. And then there was the print. A palm mark in blood pressed into the bedsheet beside Judy's body. What stood out wasn't just the blood, it was what was missing. 2 fingers. Just like Oscar Franklin Smith, Judy's estranged husband. A man who'd lost those fingers years earlier in an accident. And suddenly, everything pointed to him. The motive, the history, and now, a signature left in blood. On July 26, 1990, Oscar Franklin Smith was found guilty of capital murder, and 2 days later, they sentenced him to death. Frank's first execution date was set for December 3, 1990, just 5 months after his death sentence. But the appeals came fast, and everything was put on hold. For more than 3 decades, he stayed on death row while his legal team fought to overturn the case. They challenged evidence, filed motions, and pleaded for more time. But none of it worked. In 2022, Tennessee gave him a new date, April 21st. For what he believed would be his last meal, he ordered a double bacon cheeseburger, deep dish apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. But just hours before the injection, Governor Bill Lee issued a surprise reprieve. The execution was called off after officials discovered the drugs hadn't been properly tested for endotoxins. That mistake halted every execution in the state for the rest of the year. Tennessee's Department of Corrections spent the next 2 years overhauling the protocol. For the 4th time in 35 years, Frank faced the clock again. His new date, May 22, 2025. And just like before, he was allowed to request a final meal. This time, he asked for hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. On the morning of his execution, Frank lay strapped to the gurney, his hands still and eyes open. His spiritual advisor stood nearby, softly praying and singing the hymn, "I'll Fly Away." At 10:32 a.m., the curtain separating the execution chamber from the witness room was drawn back. In those final moments, Frank spoke quietly with the advisor. "I didn't kill her," he said. 2 IV lines had been placed in Frank's right arm. When asked for his final words, he took his time, speaking for nearly 3 minutes. "Somebody needs to tell the governor the justice system doesn't work," he said. "He's the last word, the last person to give justice where justice is needed. Too many innocent people are being killed." His tone hardened. "He needs to quit. Get a backbone," he said. "Our justice system is broken, and he has the power to stop this." He looked out toward the witnesses. "We have more men waiting to die at Riverbend. I won't be the first, and I won't be the last." As the pentobarbital began flowing through the IV lines, Frank kept speaking, but his voice grew weaker. By 10:38 a.m., he was struggling to form words, then stopped speaking altogether. His stomach was rising and falling slowly, and it looked like he fell asleep. At 10:47 a.m., he was declared dead. Oscar Franklin Smith was 75 years old. The next execution took place in June. On June 10, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Floyd Wainwright was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do to end up on death row? It all started on April 27, 1994, when Carmen Gayhart didn't show up to pick up her 2 kids from daycare. She was 23 years old, a nursing student in Lake City, Florida, and a mother of 2 young children aged 5 and 3. But that afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. Just 2 days before Carmen vanished, Anthony Wainwright and Richard Hamilton broke out of a minimum security prison in North Carolina. One was doing time for burglary, the other for armed robbery. But they weren't interested in finishing their sentences. They stole a Cadillac, broke into a home, grabbed 2 rifles, and headed south toward Florida, armed, reckless, and already on the edge of violence. In Lake City, their stolen car gave out, overheated and useless. That's when they saw Carmen, 23 years old, loading groceries into her Bronco in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. They pulled a gun and forced her into the vehicle. Hours later, deep in the woods behind a truck stop, both men raped her. And afterward, Anthony strangled her with his bare hands, then shot her twice in the head. Insurance, in his words. They left her in the dirt like she was nothing and drove off in her car. The next day, a state trooper spotted the Bronco in Mississippi. In custody, they talked, but both blamed the other one for the killing. But where was the body? Eventually, Richard drew a map to the location where they dumped the body, and on May 2nd, deputies found Carmen's body, decomposed, discarded, and buried under brush. Her hyoid bone was broken, and her teeth were scattered in the dirt. It confirmed what investigators already feared. Carmen had fought for her life and lost. Back in Florida, prosecutors offered Anthony a deal, no death penalty if he told the full truth and passed a polygraph. But after 2 weeks of interviews, he finally admitted to the and refused the test. Then came the DNA results. His fluid was found in Carmen's car. The deal was gone. In May 1995, both men were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. 2 juries, 2 death sentences, and not once did either of them show remorse. Then, on January 13, 2023, the case quietly closed for one of them. Richard Hamilton died in prison of natural causes at the age of 59. The official cause of death was never made public, but after nearly 30 years on death row, his time ran out before the state ever carried out the sentence. Then, after spending more than 30 years on death row, Anthony's final day came. On the morning of June 10, 2025, he woke up around 3:30 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Officials offered him a last meal, but he politely declined. According to the Reverend, Anthony was very afraid of what was coming. While strapped to the gurney, he was asked if he had any final words. Anthony turned to the victim's family first. "I hope my death brings you peace and healing," he said. But then his tone shifted. He called his court-appointed attorney Florida's worst and said the justice system in the state was broken beyond repair. "Please continue the fight," he told those opposing the death penalty, "because I can promise you they are not going to let up. They will continue to murder if we continue to let it happen." Most of his final words, though, were for his fiancée Samantha, the woman who had taken his last name, even though they were never legally married. "You are the love of my life. I'm so blessed we found each other," he told her. "The years we have spent together have been beyond wonderful. They have been downright magical. Love is stronger than death, and I know our love will last for eternity." The drug started flowing at 6:10 p.m. Anthony's shoulders shuddered once, then again. He blinked hard, pulled in a few sharp breaths, then stopped moving altogether. By 6:14, he lay completely still. At 6:22 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Anthony Floyd Wainwright was 54 years old. At that exact moment, another execution was unfolding in Alabama. A different state, a different method, but the same final outcome. Gregory Hunt had spent almost 30 years on death row, and the story that led him to die by nitrogen gas was just as haunting. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1988, paramedics stepped into a small apartment in Cordova, Alabama, and into a scene that stopped them cold. Karen Lane, just 29 years old, lay dead on the kitchen floor, beaten, broken, and violated. Her injuries were catastrophic. She suffered 60 separate wounds, her ribs were shattered, her liver was torn, she had a ruptured aorta, and there was a broken broomstick lying between her legs. From the moment officers saw the scene, they knew this wasn't random. The man responsible was Gregory Hunt, Karen's boyfriend of only a few weeks. In the days leading up to the murder, his jealousy had turned volatile. He stalked her, threatened her, and even lit her vacant house on fire the night before. That night, he called her roommate with a chilling message. "Karen's lying here on the kitchen floor. Someone should get her to a hospital." And by the time police arrived, she was already gone. Greg fled, but when his sister asked him directly, "Did you kill her?" Greg answered without hesitation, "Yes." He blamed the drugs, the alcohol, and the anger. He said he snapped, but the evidence didn't waver. His bloody palm print was on the wall, his DNA was in her mouth, and his fingerprints were everywhere. On June 19, 1990, a jury convicted him on 3 counts of capital murder, for killing her during a burglary, during a sexual assault, and for taking the life of someone who couldn't legally consent. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. 11-1 was enough to send Gregory to death row. Gregory Hunt's final day came on June 10, 2025. He skipped a last dinner meal the night before, but for lunch he chose a tray of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. When the curtain pulled back at 5:52 p.m., Gregory lay strapped to the gurney, wrapped in a white sheet with a mask over his face. After the death warrant was read, Greg declined to say any final words, but did give a thumbs up and what appeared to be a peace sign. But not long before that moment, in a phone call, he had spoken plainly. At first, he insisted he wasn't your typical death row inmate. Then he said 6 words that stuck. "I don't have no pity party." He paused, then added, "You know, I'm just battling until I get a break, or they snuff my light out." When asked about the crime itself, his voice changed. "I can't explain what happened," he said quietly. "All I can say is that she didn't deserve what happened to her." On the night of June 10th, the gas started flowing sometime after 5:55 p.m. At 5:57, Greg briefly shook, gasped, and raised his head off the gurney. He let out a moan at about 5:59 p.m. and raised his feet. Then he took a series of 4 or more gasping breaths with long pauses in between. And by 6:05 p.m., he stopped moving altogether. His left fist remained clenched long afterward. Gregory Hunt was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. Gregory Hunt was 65 years old. Just 2 days later, the next inmate was strapped to the gurney, this time in Oklahoma. More than 25 years after he committed a brutal crime, George John Hanson was executed by lethal injection. Let's take a look at what he did. On the evening of August 31, 1999, 77-year-old Mary Bowles was just trying to load her car outside Tulsa Promenade Mall. A retired banker and longtime hospital volunteer, she had no idea 2 armed men were watching her, waiting. Their names were George John Hanson, also known as John Fitzgerald Hanson, and Victor Miller, and by that point, they had already robbed 2 liquor stores and now needed a clean vehicle to keep going. Victor took the wheel while John forced Mary into the backseat at gunpoint. They headed north into the dark, pulling off the road near Owasso and into a dirt pit. But someone was already there, Gerald Thurman, a trucking company owner. Victor shot Gerald 4 times and left him bleeding on the ground. The 2 men kept driving with Mary still in the car. Somewhere along a quiet rural road, they pulled over, dragged her out, and John shot her multiple times. Her body was left beneath a pile of branches. Gerald was found first, still alive, but he died 2 weeks later without regaining consciousness. Mary's body wasn't discovered until a week after the shooting. In the meantime, John and Victor kept moving, using her car to check into a motel, robbing stores, and staying 1 step ahead, until Victor's wife tipped off the police. Officers arrested them at an Econo-Lodge in Muskogee, finding the murder weapons hidden in the toilet tank. Forensics confirmed their prints in Mary's car, and a witness, John's friend, testified that John had bragged about the killings. Both men were charged with 2 counts of murder and federal robbery. John went to trial in May 2001. The jury found him guilty and recommended death for Mary's murder and life without parole for Gerald's. He was transferred to federal prison to serve his robbery sentence while awaiting execution. Victor's trial came next. He had already served time for murder before, but this time the evidence was overwhelming. Like John, he received death for Mary and life for Gerald. But Victor appealed his death penalty successfully, and he was sentenced to life instead. He remains in prison to this day. At his clemency hearing on May 7th, John tried to explain himself. Speaking through a video link, his voice low but steady, John expressed remorse for his involvement in the crimes and apologized to the victims' families. "I'm not an evil person," he said. "I was caught in a situation I couldn't control. I can't change the past, but I would if I could." However, during that hearing, clemency was denied, and the execution date remained in place. John didn't request anything special for his final meal. No favorites, no last indulgences. Just the standard tray handed out that Wednesday evening, which was chicken pot pie, 2 rolls, 2 fruit cups, and carrots. Ordinary food on an extraordinary night. Then his final morning came. On June 12, 2025, John was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Strapped to the gurney, John spoke his last words. "Just forgive me and peace to everyone." The execution began at 10:01 a.m. After the drugs began to flow, a doctor entered the death chamber at 10:06 a.m. and declared him unconscious. The process was smooth without any reported complications. He was pronounced dead at 10:11 a.m. George John Hanson was 61 years old. Just one day later, after spending almost 20 years on death row, Stephen Stanko was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. Stephen Stanko knew how to present himself. On the surface, he looked like a man rebuilding his life, a thoughtful, well-spoken ex-con with a book under his belt and a story to tell. But that book was born out of a decade-long sentence for assault and kidnapping handed down in 1996, of which he served nearly 9 years. After getting out of prison in 2004, Stephen Stanko settled in Myrtle Beach. He told people he wanted a fresh start, but something darker was brewing. He spent long hours at the public library under the pretense of writing a book about serial killers. There, he charmed a librarian named Laura Ling. She invited him into her home, where she lived with her 15-year-old daughter. But on April 7, 2005, that trust shattered. Stephen claimed an argument spiraled out of control, but what followed was a calculated attack. He tied Laura up and beat her, then assaulted her daughter. When the girl woke up, dazed and bloodied, she saw Stephen strangle her mother. But when she tried to stop him, he slit her throat and walked away, believing she was dead. But she survived. She dialed 911 and gave police just enough time to start hunting. At the same time, Stephen had already driven to Conway, where he manipulated 74-year-old Henry Turner into letting him stay the night. The next morning, Stephen walked toward him with a gun and shot him, beat him, and fired again. After killing Henry, Stephen drained his bank account and used the money to bar hop in Columbia, laughing and buying drinks. By the time he reached Augusta, Georgia, he was pretending to be a wealthy businessman in town for the Masters Golf Tournament. But on April 12th, the woman he was staying with saw his face in the paper, and she called the police. Hours later, Stephen was arrested without a fight. Inside his home, investigators found articles on Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, and other serial killers, clear signs that he'd been studying them. In 2006, he stood trial for Laura's murder and was sentenced to death, and he got 110 more years for the assault and attempted murder of her daughter. In 2009, he was convicted again for killing Henry and handed another death sentence. On Friday, June 13, 2025, Stephen's time ran out. He ate fried fish, fried shrimp, crab cakes, a baked potato, carrots, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. On his final evening, he was strapped to the gurney with one arm outstretched, where medical staff inserted an IV line to administer the lethal drug. The execution began after Stephen's attorneys read a 3.5-minute final statement. In it, Stephen apologized to his victims and asked not to be judged by the worst day of his life. "I am truly sorry for the pain and loss that I caused in this horrible situation. Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said." He also talked about how he was an honor student and athlete and a volunteer, and asked several times not to be judged by the night he killed 2 people. "I have lived for approximately 20,973 days, but I am judged solely for 1. He once again apologized to his victims and their families. "Once I am gone, I hope that Christina, Laura's family, and Henry's family can all forgive me. The execution may help them. Forgiveness will heal them." When the signal came, the prison officials asked for the first dose of the sedative pentobarbital. Stephen moved his lips, appearing to be saying words, and turned toward the families of the victims. He then let out several quick breaths as his lips quivered. He appeared to stop breathing after a minute. A prison employee asked for a second dose of pentobarbital about 13 minutes later. Stephen was pronounced dead at 6:34 p.m. Stephen Christopher Stanko was 57 years old. 11 days later, the next execution was scheduled. On June 24, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. On May 23, 1994, Thomas vanished into the night after bar hopping through Orlando with friends. But while his roommates wrapped up their evening at Barbarella's nightclub, Thomas disappeared. Around 2 a.m., 22-year-old Michelle McGrath left the same club to get her car, but she never made it. Her fiancé searched, but the lot was silent. The next morning, a school staffer found her body crumpled behind a brick wall near the Pace School, naked, lifeless, and discarded like trash. At nearly the same time, a man flagged down a cop nearby to report a strange pile of clothing beside a red Geo Metro. But by then, Thomas had already fled the scene, driving off in Michelle's stolen car. Another woman, Rochelle Smith, had narrowly escaped a similar attack at the same club just an hour before Michelle. When she saw news of the killing, she went straight to police and identified Thomas from a photo lineup. Another witness did the same, and Thomas's roommates, horrified by what they saw when he came home, bloodied with raw knuckles and torn-up hands, told detectives everything. Then came the forensic evidence. His DNA on Michelle's body, his fingerprints on the car and alley gate, and his own words, cold, explicit confessions of and The jury didn't hesitate, and in June 1995, Thomas was sentenced to death. He also received multiple life sentences. Florida made it official. He would never walk free again. On June 24, 2025, his final day came. That morning, Thomas woke up at 4:45 a.m. alone with his thoughts. He had just one visitor that day, his mother. No spiritual advisor, no final prayers, just silence and the slow ticking of time. For his last meal, Thomas requested a pepperoni pizza, fries, and a soda. When the curtain to the execution room opened at 6 p.m., Thomas already lay strapped to a gurney with an IV in his left arm, wearing a plain white shirt and dark pants. From a distance, he looked calm, with healthy color in his skin and no visible signs of fear or pain. When the curtain rose, Thomas was already scanning the witness room, his eyes moving slowly and his head turning just slightly. There was no spiritual advisor at his side. The warden finished his call with the governor's office and leaned in. He asked if Thomas had any final words. The microphone was too far away, and the hum of the air conditioning was too loud, so no one in the witness chamber could make out what he said. But a prison spokesman later shared that Thomas had made a quiet repentance and mentioned the name of Jesus. However, his exact words have not yet been released. When the drugs began to flow, Thomas's eyes began to roll back and his breathing shortened. After several minutes, he lost color in his face and fell still. He appeared unconscious. The usual checks followed. A guard leaned in, called his name, and flicked at his eyelid. But no response came. The signal was given, and then came the next 2 doses. After this, the prison warden announced that the sentence had been carried out. The curtain to the execution chamber closed, and witnesses were escorted out. At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 51 years old. Just 1 day later, the final execution for June 2025 was carried out, this time in Mississippi. On June 25, 2025, after spending almost 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. Let's look at what he did. On the morning of January 12, 1976, Edwina Martyr kissed her kids goodbye and stepped into the last day of her life. As her killer, 29-year-old Richard, was already circling. He was a broke and desperate veteran, and he had picked her family at random. He dialed her husband's bank to get a name, hunted down their address and showed up at her door pretending to be a utility worker. Edwina let him in while her toddler slept in the other room. He pulled a gun and forced her to leave her son behind, then drove her into the forest, where he shot her in the back of the head and left her body under the trees. But just hours later, he called her husband to demand a $25,000 ransom, pretending she was still alive. What followed was a string of lies, fake drop-offs, and phone calls where Richard calmly claimed Edwina was asking about her children, but she was already gone. After collecting the ransom from a decoy drop, he tried to flee but didn't get far. Police caught him at a roadblock and he confessed everything. The weapon, the car, the body, he gave it all up. But what should have ended there didn't. Instead, Richard's case dragged on for decades. 4 times he was sentenced to death, and 3 times that sentence was overturned. At one point, he accepted a deal for life without parole, only for the courts to rule that that wasn't legal when the crime occurred. And that was it. This time, the sentence stood. But even then, it would take another 27 years before it was carried out. For decades, Richard sat in a cell while the world outside changed. He grew old behind those walls and became the oldest, longest-serving death row inmate Mississippi had ever seen. But time didn't stop for him. He wrote short stories, took on prison jobs, and lived long enough to see the state's execution method change from gas chamber to lethal injection. But none of it changed what was coming. The sentence had been signed, the date set, and the final steps were already underway. On June 25, 2025, after spending nearly 50 years on death row, Richard's final day came. The Mississippi Department of Corrections allowed his loved ones to stay with him until 4 p.m., the cutoff before the preparations began. That's when he was offered his final meal, for which he requested chicken tenders, fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. At 6 p.m., Richard was strapped to the gurney. The room was still. Observers sat behind the glass as staff moved through the final steps. Richard's wife, Marcia, witnessed the execution, along with his lawyer and a spiritual advisor. His wife and lawyer dabbed their eyes several times. When asked if he had any last words, Richard spoke clearly. "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family." He also thanked his lawyers and his wife and asked for forgiveness. His last words just before the drugs flowed were, "I love you very much. I will see you on the other side, all of you." After the first injection, a staff member checked his consciousness. Once they confirmed he was no longer responsive, the rest of the process moved forward. By 6:16 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Richard Gerald Jordan was 79 years old. The first execution of July was on the 15th, when Michael Bernard Bell was strapped to the gurney. But to understand how he ended up on death row in the first place, we have to go back to a cold December night in 1993. It started outside a Jacksonville liquor lounge. Mike was out for blood. Just 5 months earlier, his brother Lamar had been shot and killed by a man named Theodore Wright. The court called it self-defense, but Mike didn't care. He told anyone who would listen he was going to settle the score. And he meant it. He got his hands on an AK-47, a full clip, and 160 rounds of ammo, supplied by his girlfriend Erica. On December 9th, he spotted a yellow Plymouth parked outside the lounge and believed it belonged to Theodore, but Theodore had sold it. Inside were 3 young people who had nothing to do with Lamar's death. 22-year-old Jimmy West, Theodore's half-brother, 18-year-old Tamika Smith, and one of her friends. But Mike didn't know that, and he didn't care to check. He pulled on a mask, raised the rifle, and opened fire. 12 bullets ripped into Jimmy, killing him instantly. 4 hit Tamika. She died on the way to the hospital. The 3rd woman ducked into the floorboard and survived. But Mike wasn't done. He turned toward the crowd outside and opened fire again. Bullets hit the wall and the surrounding, almost hitting innocent people. Later that night, he went to his aunt's house and calmly said, "Theodore got my brother, and now I got his." Police had witnesses but no arrest, until a year later when two inmates came forward with a name. One of them claimed to be there that night. Then Erica, Mike's girlfriend, confirmed she had helped him get the rifle the day before the murders, and this sealed his faith. At trial, Mike claimed self-defense, just like Theodore had, but no one believed it. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and gave him 2 death sentences. But that wasn't the full story. During the trial, Mike confessed to 2 more murders and a toddler. Back in 1989, he had shot and killed his girlfriend, LaShawn Cowart, and her 2-year-old son, Travis, during an argument in a car. Then, in 1993, just 4 months before the liquor lounge shooting, he tracked down and killed his mother's abusive boyfriend, Michael Johnson. In total, Mike had left 5 people dead. He got 25 more years for the earlier killings. And for the next 30 years, he sat on death row while his attorneys fought every angle: racial bias, prosecutorial language, witness inconsistency. But none of it stuck. Every appeal failed. On Tuesday, July 15, 2025, Mike woke up at 6:30 in the morning. He had a final meal of an omelet, bacon, home fries, and a glass of orange juice. Afterward, he met with a spiritual advisor, but no one else came to visit. He had filed a last-minute appeal, hoping the U.S. Supreme Court would intervene, but they denied his request. And with that, the clock kept moving. At 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney inside the execution chamber. The IV lines were inserted, and the warden stepped forward to ask if he had any last words. Mike looked up and said, "Thank you for not letting me spend the rest of my life in prison." And with that, the drugs began to flow. His chest rose once, then settled. A few minutes later, at 6:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Michael Bernard Bell was 54 years old. Let's move on to the next one. On July 31st, 2025, after spending 29 years on death row, Edward J. Zakrzewski was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Let's go back and look at how this case unfolded. It was June 9, 1994, in the quiet town of Mariester, Florida. Edward was 29 years old, a technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, and married with 2 young kids. On the outside, he looked stable, disciplined, dependable. But that picture was already falling apart. His marriage to Sylvia was on its last legs, and he'd made threats before. Neighbors had heard him say it. If she ever tried to leave, he'd kill the whole family before letting that happen. And that morning, Edward got a call at work. His 7-year-old son, Kim, was on the line. Calmly, the boy told his father that Sylvia was filing for divorce and taking them to Korea with her. Edward said nothing. He left the base during lunch, walked into a hardware store, and bought a machete. Then he went right back to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. That night, he came home first. He hid the machete in the bathroom. Nearby, he laid out a crowbar and a rope. Then he waited. Sylvia walked through the front door, unaware her husband had turned their home into a kill zone. She sat down in the living room, exhausted. Edward came up behind her and brought the crowbar down hard, once, then again. She collapsed but didn't die. He dragged her to the bedroom and strangled her with the rope. Then he called for Kim. The boy walked in to brush his teeth. That was the routine, but this time Edward wasn't brushing his teeth. He was ending lives. He raised the machete and swung. Kim tried to block the blade with his arm, but it wasn't enough. The second swing hit his neck, and the third one hit his back. The boy collapsed and died next to the sink. Then came 5-year-old Anna. Edward lured her with the same command and hit her with the same betrayal. She tried to protect herself too. Cuts on her hands and elbows proved she saw it coming. But like her brother, she didn't stand a chance. Edward dragged Sylvia's body into the bathroom and placed her next to the children. Unsure if she was dead, he swung the machete one final time, and when he was done, he just walked out the door, drove to Orlando, flew to Hawaii, and disappeared. Under the name Michael Green, he joined a secluded religious commune and slept in a shack on a hillside like the world had never known his name. Back in Florida, silence didn't last. Edward failed to show up at work the next day. Military police filed him as AWOL, and deputies were sent to check the house. Inside, they found what he left behind: 3 bodies, blood everywhere, and a missing husband. Edward lived quietly under a false name until October 15, 1994, when Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode with his photo. The family he'd been living with saw it. Their preacher turned to him and said, "Brother Michael, that looks a lot like you." Edward said nothing. He left a note that read, "I'm sorry." 9 days later, Edward walked into a police station and turned himself in. But the question still hung in the air. What had driven him to destroy everything? 10 days after his arrest, Edward was flown back to Florida and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. In March 1996, he stood in court and confessed. Therefore, the trial moved straight to sentencing, where they asked for the death penalty on all 3 counts. On April 19, 1996, Edward received 3 death sentences. For the next 29 years, Edward sat on death row. He filed appeal after appeal, but nothing stuck. Then, on July 31st, his final day began before sunrise. Edward woke up around 5 a.m. and quietly prepared for what was coming. He was allowed one final visit, but he declined the offer to meet with a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, he ordered fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, fried onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, a scoop of ice cream, and a cup of coffee to wash it all down. Later that day, Edward was led into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. The curtain to the witness room rose at around 6 p.m., and by then he was already covered with a white sheet. There were 14 witnesses present, plus media reporters and prison staff. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Edward didn't hesitate. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible," he said. "I have no complaints whatsoever." Then, in a calm voice, he began quoting Robert Frost's famous poem, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." He didn't finish the poem as his voice trailed off partway through. At 6:04 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Edward gasped a few times, his chest rising and falling in sharp jolts. But within moments, his breathing slowed. By 6:12 p.m., he was still. Officials pronounced him dead just 1 minute later at 6:13 p.m. Edward Zakrzewski was 60 years old. And that was all for July. Let's continue with August. On August 5th, 2025, after spending 35 years on death row, Byron Lewis Black was executed by lethal injection in Tennessee. But what did he do to end up there? On March 25, 1988, Byron Black walked out of the Davidson County Workhouse on another weekend furlough. He returned Monday evening at 5:10 p.m., calm, silent, unchanged. But something had happened. Over that weekend, Byron had murdered 3 people. The bodies just hadn't been discovered yet. Sunday night, 29-year-old Angela Clay clocked out of her shift at Vanderbilt Hospital around 10 p.m. Her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Byron Black, was there to pick her up and bring her home. That night, while the apartment was quiet, Byron slipped in. Angela and her 2 daughters were sound asleep. LaToya in the bed next to her, and Lakeisha slept in the next room. Byron raised a revolver and shot Angela once through the top of the head. She died instantly. Then LaToya stirred. Maybe she shifted. Maybe she whispered. And when he heard that, Byron turned and fired again without hesitation. The bullet ripped through her chest and neck, and the force shoved her sideways into the narrow space between the bed and the dresser. Blood filled her lungs, and her body twitched for nearly 10 minutes before going still. Byron then entered Lakeisha's room. She had woken up from the sounds, but she knew his face. She might have thought he came to check on her. But instead, he fired 2 more shots, one to her chest, one near her hip. She fell from the bed, dragged herself a few feet. She was trying to get to safety, her blood streaking the floor. But then she stopped moving. Byron locked the door on his way out and returned his borrowed freedom, checking in from furlough on time like nothing had happened. After the murders, forensics found bullet fragments near Angela's head, LaToya's pillow, and Lakeisha's mattress. They found the kitchen phone receiver in the bedroom, the base in the hall, and 3 fingerprints. All belonged to Byron Black. And then came the last piece they needed. This hadn't been the first time Byron pulled the trigger. In 1986, he had shot Angela's ex-husband, Benny Clay, after an argument, and one of those bullets got stuck under Benny's collarbone. Surgeons removed it, and ballistics matched it to the weapon used on Angela and the girls. It was the first time lead pulled from a living person tied a killer to 3 fresh graves. He would spend the next 36 years on death row. The night before the execution, Byron was given his last meal, a quiet ritual before the state moved forward. He had requested a pizza, topped with mushrooms and sausage, donuts, and butter pecan ice cream. On the morning of August 5, 2025, Byron was led into the execution chamber. He was already strapped to the gurney when the curtain rose at 10:31 a.m. A sheet covered his body, which was standard, but this time it was pulled unusually high, even covering his hands. He faced the witnesses, but when he was asked if he had any last words, he simply said, "No, sir." He didn't speak to the victim's family, who were seated just feet away, and he didn't apologize. Witnesses said he showed clear signs of distress, heavy breathing, restlessness, and confusion. It looked, they said, like he didn't fully understand what was happening to him. A final mic check was done. His spiritual advisor stood nearby, touching his cheek, praying and offering quiet encouragement. She also told him to focus on his breathing. Byron began sighing and breathing heavily, almost panting, as if fear was overtaking him. When the drugs started flowing, he looked around and raised his head, clearly unsettled. Witnesses described him as moving more than expected. At 10:33, he was groaning. "I can't do this," he told his spiritual advisor. "This is hurting so bad." The advisor leaned in, calm but helpless, and said softly, "I'm so sorry." Then she continued praying. Just a few moments later, he raised his hand one final time, then went still at 10:36 a.m. By then, the full dose had been administered. A mandatory 5-minute waiting period followed, and at 10:43 a.m., Byron was pronounced dead. Byron Lewis Black was 69 years old. The next execution took place on August 19, 2025. After spending 43 years on death row, Kayle Barrington Bates was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But what did he do that got him on death row in the first place? On June 14, 1982, 24-year-old Janet Renee White was attacked at her office in Lynn Haven, Florida. That morning had started like any other. A slow Monday, with Renee catching her favorite soap opera on lunch break while her husband Randy made her a sandwich. At 1 p.m., she left home with a honk and a wave. Minutes later, she returned to her desk and answered the phone. On the line was her friend Geraldine Gilchrist, but the call turned into a nightmare. Renee suddenly screamed, and then the line went dead. Officers arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Her white car was still parked outside, but Renee was gone. Her body was found in the woods 50 feet behind the office. She had been beaten, stabbed repeatedly, and sexually assaulted. There was male DNA on her legs, and her wedding ring was missing. And then, from the tree line, a man emerged. Kayle Barrington Bates, a delivery driver, walked out of the woods with cattails in his hand. His shirt was streaked with mud, his jeans were soaked, and there was blood on him. He claimed he was just picking plants. But when police questioned him, the lies began to pile up. At first, he denied knowing anything. Later, he claimed he stopped to ask for directions. Then he said he saw a white man attacking Renee and fled. Lastly, he said Renee had sprayed him with mace, they struggled, and she stabbed herself. He admitted trying to force himself on her, but denied stealing her ring, which they had found in his pocket. When he finally testified, he denied saying any of it. Now he claimed he slept in his truck, woke up, found the office trashed, saw her body, and ran in panic. But the jury didn't believe him. In 1983, Kayle was convicted of kidnapping, armed robbery, attempted sexual battery, and first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. After 43 years, he finally had a date, August 19, 2025. That day, Kayle woke up at 5:15 a.m. Like many on death row, he had the option to request a final meal, something familiar, comforting, or symbolic. But Kayle declined. He didn't want anything. Instead, he sat quietly in his cell, waiting. He had 3 visitors that morning, his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law. And while he could have met with a spiritual advisor before the execution, he chose not to. As the hours passed, he didn't speak much. He just waited for what was coming. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney inside the Florida State Prison. Just a few feet away, Renee's husband, Randy White, sat among the witnesses, still grieving after all these years. He said justice had taken far too long. "This has just been hanging out there for 43 years, he told reporters, worried that either he or Kayle might die before the execution ever happened. But now, with the end finally in sight, Randy said he could let go of at least part of the pain. "At least this part I can put behind me and not think of it again," he said. "I can be done with it." The execution began at 6:01 p.m. When asked if he had any final words, Kayle simply said no. No words for his loved ones, no message for the victim's husband, and no apologies. About a minute after the drugs started flowing, Kayle began breathing faster, but that only lasted for a moment. Within another minute, he stopped. At 6:05 p.m., the warden stepped forward, touched his face, shook his shoulders, and called out his name. But Kayle didn't respond. A few minutes later, at 6:17 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Kayle Barrington Bates was 67 years old. And that brings us to the last person executed in August 2025. On August 28, 2025, after spending 33 years on death row, Curtis Lee Windom was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But what did he do to end up strapped to a gurney? "You're going to read about me," Curtis Windom said on the day that everything went south. And they did, but for all the wrong reasons. Curtis Lee Windom was just 26 years old on February 7, 1992, when he set off on a path that left 3 people dead before the sun went down. But for Curtis, that day wasn't the beginning. It was the breaking point, years in the making. At the center of it all was 27-year-old Valerie Davis, his on-again, off-again girlfriend, and the mother of their 9-month-old daughter. At the time, Valerie lived with her mother, Mary Lubin, who had been just 14 when Valerie was born. Curtis also had a best friend, 23-year-old Johnny Lee, who owed Curtis $2,000 in drug money. And worse, there were rumors swirling that Johnny was seeing Valerie behind Curtis's back. And that February morning, everything boiled over. A man named Jack Luckett told Curtis that Johnny had just walked away from the dog track with a small payout, just $114. It wasn't much, but to Curtis, it felt like a slap in the face. He lost it, looked at Jack and said, "You're going to read about me." By noon that day, he had purchased a handgun, shot and killed his best friend Johnny Lee in public, gunned down his ex-girlfriend Valerie Davis in her apartment, and fatally shot Valerie's mother, Mary Lubin, at an intersection. He also shot Kenneth Williams, whom he suspected of being a police informant. But Kenneth survived after a month in the hospital. Witnesses were everywhere, and Curtis was arrested later that same day. In November 1992, a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and the judge sentenced Curtis to death for each of the 3 murders and added 22 years for the attempted murder of Kenneth. In his 33 years on death row, his daughter, who was 9 months old at the time of the killings, visited him regularly and spoke out in favor of mercy. She said executing him wouldn't bring her mother or grandmother back. She learned the truth about her father at age 11 and struggled with it for years, but eventually forgave him. When his execution neared, she tried to stop it, calling him flawed, but not evil. But it didn't matter. His days were numbered. Curtis's final appeal for a stay was rejected on August 27, 2025, and 1 day later, his final day came. He woke up at 5 a.m. knowing the clock had run out. Officials later said he seemed in good spirits, but he had no visitors on his last day. For his last meal, he requested ribs, baked beans, collard greens, potato salad, and a slice of pie. When the curtain rose, Curtis was already strapped to the gurney, a white sheet pulled up to his chin. Moments later, at 6 p.m., the sedative began to flow. Curtis mumbled something about being on death row, quiet and impossible to understand. But no one interrupted. He took a long, deliberate breath, then another. His chest rose and fell. His legs twitched several times, and then he went still. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Curtis Windom was 59 years old. The first execution of September took place on September 17th, when David Pittman was executed after 32 years on death row. Let's look at what he did. On May 15, 1990, at around 2:30 in the morning, 28-year-old David Pittman slipped out of his house and started the short half-mile walk toward his soon-to-be ex-family-in-law's home. He told himself he only wanted to talk, but somewhere along that quiet stretch of road, he already knew it wasn't going to end that way. The night air was still, but inside his head it was boiling. When he reached the house, he crept to the side, climbed the fence near the shed, and tapped on Bonnie Jo Knowles' window. At first, it almost looked like a conversation. He sat down and told her how her family was making things worse, how he felt cornered. He brought up the 1985 allegation, the accusation she'd made when she was just 15, and asked why she had told them. Bonnie Jo stood her ground, reminded him of what happened, but David's mood shifted again. He started picking at her life, questioning her mental health, and then asked if she wanted to have sex. She said no, she was on her period. But he kept pressing, suggesting oral stories, anything to wear her down. Finally, she'd had enough and told him to leave. Instead, he lunged. He clamped his hand over her mouth to stop her screams, struck her hard, then snapped. He slashed her throat and stabbed her over and over until she went still. The attack wasn't quiet. Her mother, Barbara, jolted awake and rushed into the hallway. David stepped out and drove the knife into her, too. Clarence Knowles heard the screams, ran for the phone, but David was faster. Before Clarence could call for help, David beat him down and stabbed him until he collapsed by the hallway telephone. In minutes, 3 members of the Knowles family were dead. But David didn't run. He needed time. He poured gasoline through the house, shoved a tire under Bonnie Jo's bed to make it burn hotter, washed the blood from himself, then grabbed Bonnie's keys and fled in her car. Behind him, the home caught fire, and within seconds, flames were ripping across the roof. By 3:36 a.m., a newspaper delivery man spotted the blaze and called 911. Firefighters arrived at 3:42 to find half the roof blown away and the interior gutted. In Bonnie Jo's room, the destruction was worst of all. The tire under her bed had turned it into an inferno. But the autopsy told the truth. Bonnie Jo had been stabbed 8 times, Barbara 3, and Clarence 5. None of them had breathed in smoke. They were dead before the fire. At 6:30 that morning, a construction worker saw a brown Toyota stuck in a ditch less than a mile from the Knowles home. Moments later, a man set it on fire. A neighbor saw the same thing, smoke rising, a man running. When police showed them a lineup, they both picked David Pittman without hesitation. The car fire, like the house fire, was no accident. It was a final attempt to erase the evidence. By sunrise, investigators knew exactly who they were looking for. His trial began in 1991, 1 year after Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie were found dead inside their burning home. Prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with arson and grand theft. And when David finally stood before the court, he pleaded not guilty, insisting he had nothing to do with the killings. But the evidence stacked against him, witnesses, threats, and his own statements to others, told a different story. And by November 1991, the verdict was in. The jury found him guilty on every count except burglary, and the case moved into the penalty phase. That's where his violent history and the cruelty of the murders weighed heavily, and the question was no longer what happened, but what price he would pay for it. David's final appeal was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court on the 26th, and by the next morning, the end was already in motion. He woke up at 5:45 a.m. under the same cold lights that had marked every day on death row. Hours later, he sat down for his final meal, steak, chicken, and biscuits, quiet, knowing there was nothing left to fight. Then, just before 6 p.m., they strapped him to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, David didn't hesitate. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it," he said. The execution moved forward without any complications. The staff followed the standard checks, calling his name and brushing his eyelashes, but he gave no response. At 6:12 p.m., he was pronounced dead. David Joseph Pittman was 63 years old. Up next is September 25th, when 2 executions took place. Let's start with Texas, where Blaine Milam was executed after 15 years on death row.
She was a great little girl. She was beautiful. I loved her and Jessica.
On the morning of December 2nd, 2008, 18-year-old Blaine Milam called 911 from a trailer outside Tatum, Texas. He said he'd just found his daughter dead. Inside, paramedics found 13-month-old Amora Carson lifeless on the floor. Her tiny face was battered, her body covered in bruises. Sergeant Kevin Roy arrived at what EMTs called the worst scene they'd ever witnessed. At first, the circular marks on her face looked like she'd been beaten with a can, but they were human bite marks. Blaine claimed he and his girlfriend, Jessica Bain Carson, had left Amora home alone for an hour. But their story quickly fell apart. A man Blaine claimed to meet said he hadn't seen them, and pawn shop footage showed the couple calmly pawning items that same morning. Even worse, Blaine's sister said he'd called her crying before 9:30 a.m., an hour before calling 911. When investigators dug deeper, they found more. Jessica believed Amora was possessed. Blaine told her he could perform an exorcism, and for more than 30 hours, Jessica sat in the living room while Blaine tortured Amora to death. She never called for help. When detectives searched the trailer again, they found the murder weapon, a blood-covered pipe wrench hidden under the floor. It matched Amora's blood. The bite marks matched Blaine's teeth. After his arrest, Blaine confessed. He said it wasn't murder, it was an exorcism. He claimed God told him what to do, but investigators said the evidence told the truth. Amora's skull was shattered, her bones were broken. Her tiny body showed signs of long, brutal torture. And it wasn't the first time Blaine had targeted a child. Months earlier, he had violated probation by leaving disturbing graphic notes in a young neighbor's dresser. He never should have been near Amora at all. On May 17, 2010, after weeks of testimony and days of hearing evidence about both the crime and Blaine's troubled past, the jury in Montgomery County finally reached a verdict. They had already convicted Blaine of capital murder, but now came the punishment phase: life without parole or death. By a vote of 10-2, the jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. He officially sentenced Blaine to die later that year. At the time, he was the youngest person on death row in the United States. Jessica Bain Carson was also charged. In April 2011, a separate jury found her guilty of capital murder as a party to the crime, but instead of death, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of today, she is still serving that sentence. And in 2025, he finally got a date: September 25th, 2025. After more than 15 years on death row, Blaine's time ran out. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal, so Blaine was served the same standard tray as everyone else. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Blaine didn't hesitate. He thanked the prison's chaplaincy program, one that helped him find faith during his time on death row. He said it allowed him to be accepted into it, to find Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Then he added, "And if any of you would like to see me again, I implore all of you, no matter who you are, to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again." He then gave his last words, "I love you all. Bring me home, Jesus." At 6:19 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing through the IV lines in his right hand and left arm. He grunted once, then gasped. Then his breathing slowed and turned into soft snores. Within minutes, the room went still. At 6:40 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Blaine Keith Milam was 35 years old. At that very same moment, in a different part of the country, another execution took place. After spending more than 26 years on death row, Geoffrey Todd West was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. But to understand how he ended up on death row in the first place, we have to go back to a spring night in 1997 when a quiet gas station on Nakalula Parkway turned into the scene of a cold-blooded killing. It was after midnight on March 28, 1997, in Gadsden, Alabama. Geoffrey was just 21, fresh out on parole, his life already sliding toward collapse. He drove through the dark with his girlfriend Amy Pierce, heading toward a Chevron gas station where he used to work. But this wasn't a routine visit. Geoffrey had told people exactly what he planned to do: rob the place and leave no witnesses. Inside the station, 33-year-old Margaret Maggie Berry was working the late shift. Geoffrey walked in with a .45 caliber handgun, forced her behind the counter, and took $250 from a cookie tin. Then, with Maggie on the ground, he pressed the gun to the back of her head and pulled the trigger. She died instantly. Geoffrey returned to the car, got in, and drove off like nothing happened. It didn't take long for his name to surface. A Chevron employee had seen him near the store days before, alongside a known associate named Scott Huey. Police quickly tracked Scott down, and with help from other witnesses, and the fact Geoffrey had once worked at the Chevron, the investigation snapped into focus. Within days, Geoffrey was arrested. At trial in June 1999, prosecutors laid out the case. Geoffrey had told people his plan in advance. He had written letters to Amy after the murder, some lines blacked out to hide incriminating words, later revealed by forensic examiners. The jury saw it clearly. Geoffrey West had walked into that gas station to rob and kill, and that's exactly what he did. On June 1st, 1999, the jury convicted Geoffrey of capital murder during the course of a robbery, and that same afternoon, the penalty phase began. The jury had to decide: life in prison without parole or death. Geoffrey's lawyer stood up and began to argue for mercy, laying out reasons why his client should be spared. But Geoffrey wasn't interested. In front of the court, he yanked his attorney back into his seat and told him not to say another word. He told him that he was innocent and said that he didn't want a life behind bars. If he couldn't walk out as a free man, he would rather die. And the jury took him at his word. By a vote of 10-2, they recommended death. A month later, on July 7th, the judge reviewed the case and agreed. Geoffrey was sentenced to die. On the evening of September 25, 2025, it was time. Geoffrey spent his final hours with 8 visitors, and for his final meal, he chose chicken quesadillas. His execution would be carried out using nitrogen gas, a method Alabama had only recently begun using. At 5:56 p.m., officers strapped him to the gurney. His face was calm, and he turned slightly to give his attorney a final thumbs up from behind the mask. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Geoffrey simply replied, "No, sir." But through his attorney, he left a message. He said he was deeply moved by the forgiveness offered by Maggie's son. He also shared he had converted to Catholicism earlier that year and had been baptized. "I am at peace," he wrote, "because I know where I'm going, and I look forward to seeing Mrs. Berry when I get there." Then the gas began to flow. For the first 2 minutes, he was conscious and seemed to struggle. His eyes stayed open. His chest heaved and his mouth twitched. His head rocked to the side and his left hand curled into a fist. He appeared to foam slightly at the mouth. Around 6:01, his breathing began to slow, shallow, broken by long gaps. And by 6:07, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. Geoffrey Todd West was 50 years old. The last execution of the month took place on September 30th, 2025. After spending more than 32 years on death row, Victor Tony Jones was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But what did he do, kid? On the morning of December 19, 1990, everything at Jacob and Matilda Nestor's small Miami business looked normal from the outside. Their daughter Irene had spoken with them just after 10 a.m., a routine check-in that felt light and ordinary. Even when Matilda called back to chat a little longer, there was no sign of what was about to happen. By noon, though, the calls stopped. A UPS driver arrived for a delivery and found the doors locked, the blinds drawn, and through the mail slot, a glimpse of papers scattered and dark stains on the floor. Alarmed, he ran next door to get help from Ernesto Sorondo, a neighbor who knew the Nestors, and also knew they had just hired a new worker, 29-year-old Victor Jones, the day before. When police forced the door open, the tidy office had become a crime scene. Jacob lay dead on the office floor from stab wounds to the chest. Matilda was in the bathroom, face down and stabbed between the shoulder blades, her blood streaked across the wall where she'd collapsed. But the killer hadn't fled. Slumped on the couch, a leather jacket pulled across his chest, sat Victor. Blood speckled his sneakers and pants. Beneath his arm was Jacob's loaded pistol, cocked and ready to fire. Officers shouted for him to show his hands. Slowly, he raised them and surrendered. Inside the chaos, evidence told the story. Jacob had fought back, his forehead cut open as he tried to defend himself, pulling out the knife and firing 5 rounds before collapsing. Victor had been grazed by one of the bullets but stayed inside, locking the door and waiting. In his pockets were the Nestor's wallets, keys, and Matilda's purse. His fingerprints hovered above her body on the bathroom wall. Even before detectives questioned him, Victor began to talk. At the hospital, he told a nurse, "I killed those people. They owed me money, and I had to kill them." Victor's trial began in 1992. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery, and it didn't take long for the jury to convict him on all charges. During sentencing, the state pushed for death. They listed multiple aggravating factors. Victor had been under a sentence of imprisonment at the time. He already had a prior violent felony. The murders happened during a robbery, and he had killed for financial gain. On March 1st, 1993, Victor was sentenced to death for each victim. In addition, he was given consecutive life sentences for the 2 robbery convictions. Victor kept fighting the sentence for decades, filing appeal after appeal, but every court upheld the original verdict. And in 2025, after more than 32 years on death row, the state of Florida finally gave him a date, September 30th, 2025. On the morning of his execution, Victor woke up at 4:30 a.m. He met briefly with a spiritual advisor but didn't receive any other visitors, according to a spokesperson for the Department of Corrections. Throughout the day, he followed all orders without resistance and stayed calm. When it came time for his final meal, he asked for fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. The execution proceeded without any reported issues. When asked for his final words, he simply replied, "No, sir." After the drugs were administered, a guard followed standard protocol, calling Victor's name, brushing his eyelashes, and checking for a pulse. And he showed no response. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Victor Tony Jones was 64 years old. Let's continue with October, the busiest month of 2025, with 7 executions in 6 different states. On October 10th, 2025, after more than 23 years on death row, Roy Lee Ward was executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison. But what did he do? It was a quiet summer morning in Dale, Indiana, when 24-year-old Roy knocked on the Payne family's door, pretending to look for his lost dog. 18-year-old Stacy Payne opened it to help, unaware of the danger she just let inside. Just minutes later, her sister Melissa was jolted awake by screams. She ran to the stairs and saw a man pinning Stacy to the floor. Terrified, she called 911 while hearing her sister beg him to stop. Then came Roy's cold voice. "You better be quiet." When the town marshal arrived, Roy was standing in the doorway, drenched in sweat and with a pocket knife in hand. He surrendered without a fight, saying, "I didn't do anything." But this wasn't true. Inside, Stacy lay on the kitchen floor, barely alive, her body covered in blood. Her throat had been slashed open, her wrist cut to the bone, and her injuries told the story no one wanted to believe. DNA later confirmed the assault. She was airlifted to Louisville Hospital, but 5 hours later, Stacy died of her wounds. The crime stunned the small town of Dale. Candlelight vigils filled the streets, and the courthouse overflowed with anger when Roy appeared in court. In 2002, the jury found him guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Years later, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the conviction over media bias, forcing a retrial. But even then, Roy pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. For 23 years, he lived on death row, filing appeal after appeal, until the courts and the governor finally said enough. On October 10, 2025, Roy's final day came. He was given the chance to choose his last meal, and he didn't hold back. From Texas Corral, he asked for a hamburger, a steak melt, an order of fries, a baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, a sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and a side of breadsticks. Around midnight, he was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked for any final words, Roy simply said, "Brian is going to read them." After that, the process moved forward without complications. By 12:33 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Roy Lee Ward was 47 years old. Just 4 days later were the next two executions. On October 14, 2025, after 36 years, Samuel Lee Smithers was strapped to the gurney in Florida. Let's see what he did to end up there. It started as a simple favor. In 1995, Sam agreed to mow the grass at a vacant property owned by a school teacher named Marion Whitehurst. For a year, nothing seemed unusual until Marion stopped by unannounced on May 28, 1996. She found Sam wiping down an axe next to a pool of blood near the carport, and she noticed drag marks leading toward a pond. Sam said the blood was probably from a small animal, but Marion didn't believe him. That night, she called the sheriff. When deputies arrived, the blood was gone, but two bodies floated in the pond, Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. The evidence stacked up fast. Christy's blood was found in the carport, Sam's fingerprint inside the house, and his shoe prints matched those by the pond. Surveillance video showed him with Christy just hours before she died. When questioned, Sam claimed Christy had threatened him and that things got out of hand, and he said that Denise's death had been an accident. But autopsies told another story. Both women had been strangled, beaten, and dumped into the same pond. It wasn't rage or panic. It was deliberate. At trial, Sam changed his story again, saying he was blackmailed and blamed a mysterious Mr. X for the killings, but the jury didn't buy it. They saw two women from the same institution area murdered the same way by the same man. After a short deliberation, all 12 jurors voted for death. But not everyone wanted him dead. Christy's father pleaded for mercy, asking the court to put him in jail for the rest of his life, but the judge upheld the sentence. On June 25, 1999, Sam was sentenced to die for the murders of Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. He would spend the next 36 years on death row. Then, on October 14, 2025, time finally caught up. Samuel woke up at 6:30 a.m., and officials later said he was compliant. He didn't ask for a spiritual advisor and had no visitors. But he did request one special final meal: fried chicken, fried fish, apple pie, and a scoop of ice cream. Comfort food for a man who had spent more than 2 decades counting down the days. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Sam was already strapped to the gurney with an IV line in his arm. When asked if he had any final words, Sam simply said, "No, sir." No apology, no explanation, nothing. The warden gave the signal and the drugs began to flow. At first, his chest rose and fell heavily, and his body tensed with brief convulsions. But within moments, all movement stopped. A warden stepped forward, shook him, and called out his name. But Sam didn't respond. His skin gradually turned gray as the minutes ticked by. And at 6:14 p.m., a medic entered the chamber to check for signs of life. 1 minute later, Sam was officially pronounced dead. The Department of Corrections later confirmed the execution had been carried out without complications. Samuel Lee Smithers was 72 years old. Just an hour later, an execution was carried out in Missouri. Let's find out what Lance Colin Shockley did to spend 16 years on death row. On the night of November 26, 2004, 27-year-old Lance wrecked his truck on a rural road in Van Buren, Missouri. His friend, Geoffrey Bayless, lay critically injured in the passenger seat. Lance staggered to a nearby house covered in blood and claimed he'd been in an accident. At first, he admitted he'd been driving, but hours later, when the police started asking questions, he changed his story, denying he had even been in the vehicle at all. The contradiction raised red flags with Missouri Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl Graham, who began quietly building a case. 4 months later, when Carl pressed a key witness for the truth, Lance panicked. On March 20, 2005, someone ambushed Carl outside his home. A rifle round pierced his spine and 2 shotgun blasts finished the job. He was found dead in his driveway, still wearing his uniform. When police came looking for him, Lance warned them not to return without a warrant, or someone's going to get shot. He was arrested 3 days later after witnesses had noticed his grandma's Pontiac Grand EM with a yellow sticker on the back, parked in the street for hours on the day of the attack. Prosecutors said Lance killed Carl to stop the crash investigation from turning into a criminal case. In 2009, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder, but they couldn't agree on punishment and deadlocked. The judge was able to make the decision for them and sentenced him to death. For the next 16 years, Lance claimed innocence, saying the case was built on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon, no DNA, nothing physical that could tie Lance to the murder. In the end, none of it made a difference. After 16 years on death row, the court set an execution date. October 14, 2025 would be Lance's final day. That morning, Lance spent time with his daughters and a close friend, according to prison officials. When it came to his final meal, things were kept simple. He got items from the canteen: peanut butter, 3 packs of oatmeal, water, and 2 sports drinks. By 6 p.m., he was already strapped to the gurney. The witnesses were in place, the curtain drawn, and just before the drugs began to flow, he left behind a final written message. It quoted scripture, "So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you." At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Lance Colin Shockley was 48 years old. And it wasn't long before the next execution. The very next day, October 15th, after 31 years on Mississippi death row, time ran out for Charles Ray Crawford. But what did he do? On the night of January 29, 1993, 20-year-old Christy Ray vanished from her family home in Challebeat, Mississippi. Her mother found a ransom note scrawled on the kitchen table. "There will be a red flag somewhere on this block Tuesday, 12 midnight. $15,000 in gym bag, or she dies. No police." But Mary didn't listen and immediately called the police. Hours later, the FBI joined the search. They found that the window screen had been cut, the phone line severed, and drag marks led through the yard. Then a second note was found, hidden in another home with identical handwriting. It belonged to Charles Crawford, a 26-year-old man already facing trial for rape. When officers closed in, Chuck led them into the woods and quietly pointed to a pile of leaves near an old barn. Beneath it lay Christie's body, handcuffed to a tree, gagged, and stabbed once through the heart. The evidence told a brutal story. She had fought hard, alive when the attack began, and died in agony. When questioned, Chuck first claimed he blacked out, then spun stories about panic, kidnapping, and memory loss. But every lie unraveled. His weapons, supplies, and DNA all tied him to the scene. At trial, his lawyers argued insanity, but doctors said he was faking. The jury heard about the ransom notes, the barn, the knife, and the careful cover-up. They decided he hadn't lost control. He'd made a choice. In 1994, Charles Crawford was convicted of capital murder and kidnapping and sentenced to death. And after 32 years on death row, his execution was set for October 15, 2025. That morning, officials said Chuck seemed calm. According to a spokesperson for the Mississippi Department of Corrections, he was relaxed and ready to face today. He spent time with his family and met with a preacher he had personally chosen. For his last meal, he asked for a double cheeseburger, French fries, peach cobbler, and chocolate ice cream. When asked if he had any final words, Chuck looked toward his loved ones and said, "To my family, I love you. I'm at peace. I've got God's peace." Then he turned his attention to the victim's relatives and added, "To the victim's family, true closure and true peace. You cannot reach that without God. I'll be in heaven." The process began at 6:01 p.m. Chuck took a few deep breaths, his chest rising and falling. As required under Mississippi's protocol, officials performed a consciousness check after the first drug was administered to confirm he was fully sedated. By 6:06, he was motionless and declared unconscious. And 2 minutes after that, his breathing slowed, becoming shallow and uneven, and his mouth began to quiver. Moments later, he took one final breath before his chest appeared to stop moving entirely. At 6:15 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Charles Ray Crawford was 59 years old. Just 2 days later, the next execution was already scheduled. After 29 years on death row, Richard Kenneth Jerf's life ended by lethal injection in Arizona. But what did he do? By September 1993, Richard had been stewing in anger for months. He believed Albert Luna Jr. had robbed his apartment, but police never followed up on his complaint. That silence festered, and by the time summer rolled in, Richard wanted revenge. On the morning of September 14th, he went to the Luna home carrying a 9mm pistol, a knife, latex gloves, and a bouquet of fake flowers to sweet-talk his way in. Albert's mother, 42-year-old Patricia Luna, opened the door, and Richard forced his way in. He tied her up, ransacked the house, and made her load the car with valuables. Her 5-year-old son, Damien, watched as Richard asked who should die first, but he didn't kill anyone yet. When 18-year-old Rochelle Luna walked in, he and killed her upstairs. Then, when Albert Luna Sr. came home an hour later, Richard nearly beat him to death with a bat, then shot him when he fought back. Finally, he executed Patricia and Damien in the kitchen. Before leaving, he tried to set the house on fire, but this plan failed. Richard fled in the family car, bleeding from stab wounds inflicted by Albert Sr. during the struggle. He checked into a motel and bragged to friends, unable to keep his mouth shut. Police arrested him 4 days later, and the evidence was overwhelming. He pled guilty to 4 murders, but later reversed course, trying to fight the sentence. In 1996, Richard was sentenced to death for each of the murders. He spent nearly 3 decades on death row before Arizona carried out the execution on October 17, 2025. At 5:30 p.m. the evening before his execution, he got his final meal. For that, Richard requested a double cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato, deep-fried onion rings with ketchup, and a slice of cherry pie topped with whipped cream, all from a local restaurant. The next morning at 10:01 a.m., he was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses were already in place. Richard wore all white with black flip-flops. The curtain opened at 10:07. He lay down calmly on the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he said, "I do not." When someone asked if he was okay, he nodded and said yes. But placing the IV lines proved difficult. Medical staff had to insert and remove them multiple times, up to 4 times. The right arm alone took nearly 5 minutes, and it wasn't until 9 minutes in that both lines were finally secure. Arizona's execution process has faced heavy scrutiny in recent years, especially over its repeated failures to properly set IV lines. But in Richard's case, officials said his weight made it more difficult than usual. Still, once the lines were finally set, the rest of the process moved forward without delay. At 10:24 a.m., the first dose was administered. Within 2 minutes, Richard took several heavy breaths, his mouth slightly open, and after 6 minutes, his chest stopped moving. At 10:32, a staff member entered to check for any signs of life. Richard's eyes were closed. He lay completely still, without a pulse. He was pronounced dead at 10:40 a.m. Richard Kenneth Geoffrey was 55 years old. After this marathon of executions, there was a short break. But on October 23rd, after 30 years on Alabama's death row, Anthony Todd Boyd drew his last breath. But what did he do? It started on a blistering hot Saturday, July 31st, 1993. Anthony Boyd told his friend, 22-year-old Dwinon Quinte Cox, that someone had robbed him. He said he knew who it was, Dexter Spinks, and that he needed help finding him to get even. Quinte brought a Mac 11, and together with Robert Sean Ingram and Monique Marcel Ackles, they started driving around in search of Dexter. But they never found him. However, they did see someone else, Gregory New York Hughley. A few days earlier, Gregory had taken $200 worth of drugs from Anthony and never paid, and that was all it took. When they saw him, Sean jumped out of the car, shoved Gregory into a van, and they took off. Gregory begged them not to hurt him. He said that he would pay. But the men weren't listening. They stopped for gasoline, then headed to Hall Grove Ballpark. There, they taped Gregory to a wooden bench, face down, silenced, and helpless. Sean poured the gas, struck a match, and lit him on fire. For nearly 15 minutes, they just stood there and watched him burn. The next day, a man out for a walk found Gregory's burned body in the field, but it didn't take long before tips started rolling in, and within weeks, all 4 men were arrested. By the time Anthony's trial began in 1995, prosecutors said the attack wasn't random, it was deliberate and coordinated. Anthony was charged with capital murder for a killing during a kidnapping. He claimed he wasn't involved, but a jury disagreed. On August 5, 1995, he was sentenced to die in Alabama's electric chair, a sentence later converted to death by nitrogen hypoxia. And after 33 years, his execution was set on his daughter's birthday, October 23, 2025. His execution would be carried out using nitrogen gas, a method Alabama had only recently started using. The process involved strapping a mask tightly over his face and pumping in pure nitrogen, cutting off the oxygen he needed to survive. Anthony had asked to be executed by firing squad instead, but the courts denied that request. On his final day, he spent time with 2 of his daughters, his mother, his brother, 3 friends, a son-in-law, and his spiritual advisor. He also made phone calls to a brother and a close friend. Throughout the day, he was seen eating a mix of snacks, a cheeseburger, barbecue Fritos popcorn, a Reese's cup, Skittles, Starburst, and a cheeseburger. He drank a strawberry sun-kissed, Dole lemonade, orange V8 splash, water, and coffee. He ate breakfast and lunch but turned down his dinner. He also didn't request a final meal. Later that evening, corrections officers led him into the execution chamber. The curtain to the witness room opened at 5:50 p.m. Anthony looked out and smiled toward the 4 witnesses present, his brother and 3 members of the media. He gave a thumbs up and flashed a hand sign. When asked if he had any final words, he used the moment to declare his innocence and call out the justice system. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody," he said. He criticized the courts, saying they weren't fair. "There's no justice in this state. It's all political. It's revenge motivated." Anthony said, "It's not about closure because closure comes from within, not an execution." He ended his final statement, "Keep fighting. I love every single one of y'all." And his final words before the mask sealed shut were, "Let's get it." Then the gas began to flow. At about 5:57 p.m., Anthony's body started to react. He clenched his fist and raised his head slightly off the gurney, then his legs rose several inches. A few minutes later, he began taking deep, labored breaths, long, uneven gasps that went on for at least 15 minutes. Then, finally, he stopped moving. At 6:27 p.m., the curtain to the chamber closed. The prison's commissioner later explained that the nitrogen gas continued for 5 full minutes after the heart stops, just to be sure. He was pronounced dead at 6:33 p.m. Anthony Todd Boyd was 56 years old. The 7th and last execution this month was on October 28th. On this day, Florida executed Norman Merrill Grimm after 25 years. But what for? It all started early on July 27, 1998. Around 5 a.m., deputies responded to a disturbance call at Cynthia Campbell's home in Pensacola. They found Cynthia barefoot in a nightgown, standing on the porch with her neighbor, Norman Grimm, who was only wearing cut-off jeans. There was a broken window, scattered glass, and a lug nut in the grass, but nothing that screamed danger. Right before the deputy left, Norman asked Cynthia to come over to his place for coffee, and everyone went their separate ways. But just hours later, Cynthia's co-workers reported her missing, and the police started asking questions to the neighbors, including Norman. But they didn't know that he had already killed her. He beat Cynthia with a hammer, stabbed her 11 times, 7 times through her heart, and then wrapped her in bedsheets, a shower curtain, masking tape, and black trash bags. He hid the body in his car trunk and calmly spoke with officers as they searched for her. By early afternoon, he drove to the Pensacola Bay Bridge, popped the trunk, and threw her body into the water. But she didn't stay missing for long. Just after 3:30 p.m., a fisherman and his young son hooked her body under the bridge. Wrapped in sheets and plastic, it surfaced like a horror no one saw coming. When detectives pulled the green carpet from her remains, one officer recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one he saw at Norman's back porch that very morning. Everything clicked, and by nightfall, a warrant was issued. Inside Norman's house, investigators found blood-soaked mops, Cynthia's fingerprints on a coffee cup, blood-stained trash bags, and the hammer and knife used to kill her hidden inside a cooler. But Norman was nowhere to be found. Just 3 days later, U.S. Marshals caught him in Oklahoma, and at trial, the evidence was crushing. His DNA was on the hammer, the knife, and the shorts he wore that morning. Her blood trailed across his kitchen floor. The state called it a brutal, calculated act. And Norman didn't deny it. He didn't even ask for mercy either. He asked to be killed. He refused to let his lawyers argue for life, and he wouldn't allow a single witness or plea for leniency. Even after the court appointed special counsel to look into his mental health and childhood trauma, Norman stayed silent. He wanted no defense, just death. In December 2000, the judge sentenced him to die for murder and added 390 months for sexual battery. And 25 years later, he finally got a date, October 28, 2025. But Norman still never showed remorse, never offered an explanation, and never looked back. Then his final day came. On the morning of his execution, Norman woke up around 6 a.m. According to the Department of Corrections, he didn't ask to see a spiritual advisor, and no visitors came to see him in the hours before his death. As the day wore on, he remained alone. Later that afternoon, he was served his final meal: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, a chocolate milkshake, and a slice of pie. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Norman lay strapped to the gurney, one arm stretched out with an IV already in place. When asked if he wanted to give a final statement, he kept his voice low and flat. "No, sir." Roughly a minute later, the injection began. Norman closed his eyes and drew in a few heavy breaths. His body twitched slightly, then stopped moving altogether. The warden stepped forward, shook him a few times, and called his name, but he didn't respond. At 6:13 p.m., a medic entered to check his vitals, and 1 minute later, Norman was declared dead. Norman Merle Grimm was 65 years old. The first execution of November took place on November 13th, 2025. After spending more than 45 years on death row, Brian Frederick Jennings was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do to end up there? Just before dawn on May 11, 1979, 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash slept in her room, her costume for the first grade play waiting on a chair. Her parents were asleep down the hall, unaware that someone was watching their house from the dark. 20-year-old Brian Jennings, home on leave from the Marines, had been drinking that night and drifted through the neighborhood like he often did, lingering near windows, looking for shadows that didn't belong to him. When he saw the soft nightlight glowing through Becky's window, he stopped, and this time, he didn't walk away. He slipped out the screen, crawled inside, and lifted Becky from her bed before she even opened her eyes. Brian carried her to his car and drove her to a secluded canal on Merritt Island. There, the violence exploded. He assaulted her with such force that both had visible injuries, then slammed her against the ground hard enough to fracture her skull. But Becky was still alive when he dragged her to the water and forced her head under the surface until she stopped fighting. Then he left her in the canal, alone in the dark. A fisherman found her body floating that morning. Within hours, detectives realized the killer had climbed through her window, and the fingerprints left behind matched the young Marine they had just booked on an unrelated traffic stop. By the next day, Brian cracked during interrogation. His voice stayed flat as he described taking Becky, assaulting her, and drowning her. He even drew maps and sketches with details only the killer could know. Then the case moved fast. His confession without lawyer was ruled voluntary, and at trial the jury heard it in full, Brian calmly recounting every step. Fingerprint experts tied him to the window. A cellmate testified he had bragged about the killing, and a psychiatrist told jurors Brian wasn't delusional or confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. His lawyers pointed to a chaotic childhood, an absent father, unstable home, behavioral problems, and a young life shaped by neglect. But none of it outweighed what happened at that canal. On February 7, 1980, Brian was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery, and the jury sentenced him to die on May 7, 1980. Then, on October 10, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis finally signed his death warrant, scheduling Brian's execution for November 13th. His attorneys made one last attempt to stop it, but the courts wouldn't budge. Becky would have been 53 years old by then. Instead, she never made it past 6. On the morning of his execution, Brian woke before sunrise, around 4 a.m. He ate his final meal later that day, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. No one came to see him that day. According to prison officials, he spent his final hours alone. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Brian responded with a firm no. He didn't offer an apology, not to the victim's family or to anyone else in the room. As the drugs began to flow, his chest lifted sharply and his arms twitched against the gurney. For a few minutes, the movement continued, but then it stopped. His body fell still with his mouth hanging open. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Brian Frederick Jennings was 66 years old. Just one day later, the next execution took place, this time in South Carolina. On November 14, 2025, after spending more than 17 years on death row, Stephen Corey Bryant was executed by firing squad. But how did he end up there? It began on October 5, 2004, when 23-year-old Stephen Bryant started cruising the back roads of Sumter County, knocking on doors and pretending to be lost. He looked harmless, but he was casing houses. The day after visiting one home, he returned, slipped inside, and cleared out the office. Then he hit another house, cutting the phone lines and stealing a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson with ammo. He tested it that same afternoon by shooting a fisherman, 56-year-old Clinton Brown, who somehow survived. But Stephen was only warming up. 4 days later, he met up with an old friend, Clifton Gainey. They left to buy beer, laughed like usual, and then, out of nowhere, Stephen shot him in the head. He robbed Clifton's trailer, set it on fire, and walked away. 2 days later, he forced his way into the home of 62-year-old Willard Tietjen, shot him 9 times, ransacked the place, and calmly answered the phone when TJ's wife and daughter called, telling both women that TJ was dead. Before leaving, he burned TJ's eyes with a cigarette and smeared a message on the wall in his blood. Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can. Detectives quickly linked the scenes. It was the same gun, the same style, and the same truck was spotted nearby, a battered 1990 GMC registered to Stephen. And on October 13th, ballistic testing confirmed it. One gun, one killer, every crime pointing back to him. But by then, Stephen had already killed again. Hours earlier, he'd shot 35-year-old Chris Burgess, once in the chest, once in the head, and left him to die on a rural road. That afternoon, officers found Stephen hiding at his girlfriend's house. He surrendered without a fight, and inside they found the stolen items, weapons, and evidence tying him to all 4 shootings. In 2008, Stephen pleaded guilty to 3 murders, arson, robberies, and a string of other charges. His lawyers tried to shift the focus to his past, years in state institutions, child abuse, PTSD, depression, and his attempts to get help before the killings, but prosecutors argued it was all calculated, and the jury agreed. On September 11, 2008, Stephen Bryant was sentenced to death for the murder of Willard Tietjen, plus 2 life sentences for the other killings. On October 17, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court signed his death warrant. Under state law, death row inmates could choose between lethal injection, the electric chair, or firing squad. And on October 31st, Stephen made his choice. He wanted to die the same way as his victims, so he chose the firing squad. For his final meal, Stephen asked for a spicy seafood stir-fry packed with heat, along with fried fish served over rice. He also requested egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and a slice of German chocolate cake. Then the moment came. On November 14, 2025, Stephen sat strapped to the execution chair, motionless as the warden asked if he had any final words. He didn't speak, just shook his head. No last statement, no apology for what he did. He glanced briefly at the 10 witnesses seated behind the glass, but then turned back toward the firing squad. 3 corrections officers stood behind the wall, armed with live rounds, ready to carry out the sentence. A hood was placed over his head and a target strapped over his heart. He made several heavy breaths during the 2 minutes from when the hood was placed over his head to the shots being fired. About 55 seconds later, the command was given, and the shots rang out. Stephen made no sound. The paper bullseye taped to his chest ripped forward from the impact. His body tensed, then loosened. A few shallow breaths followed by a final spasm came just over a minute later. A doctor stepped forward with a stethoscope, leaned in, and confirmed what everyone already knew. At 6:05 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Stephen Corey Bryant was 44 years old. The last execution of the month took place on November 20th. After spending more than 36 years on death row, Richard Barry Randolph was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? It was just after sunrise on August 15, 1988, when the first customers pulled into the Handyway parking lot. The lights were on, but the doors were still locked. Something didn't feel right. Minnie Ruth McCollum always opened on time. Instead, they saw Richard Randolph step out wearing a store smock, casually locking the front door. When the Patilla sisters asked where Minnie was, he smiled and said her car had broken down, that she had taken his to get it fixed, and he was heading out to pick her up. Then he climbed into Minnie's own car and drove off. But when the women pressed their faces to the glass, they believed nothing of what he just said. The counter was torn apart, the ceiling camera was ripped out, and the backroom door, which was always open, was nearly shut. They immediately called the sheriff. Deputies forced their way inside, and behind that half-closed door, they found Minnie on the floor, barely alive. Blood pooled under her, and a knife lay near her head. She was breathing, but she couldn't speak. Paramedics fought to keep her alive, and while they worked, Richard was long gone. He drove straight to his girlfriend's house and told her everything. He said he robbed the store and that he hurt Minnie. Then he grabbed the stolen lottery tickets and left for Jacksonville, promising he would return so they could run off together. But detectives already knew where to look. Richard had worked at that Handyway. He knew about the safe, the schedule, the routine, and by the next morning, they tracked him down outside a Save-A-Lot. When they confronted him, he didn't run. He talked. Richard's trial began in April 1989. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, his confession, the stolen car, the discarded clothes, the DNA, and the trail of tickets he cached along the highway. But the full weight came during sentencing. Minnie survived for 6 days before her body gave out. Doctors described injuries so severe they compared them to high-speed crashes. Her skull and face were crushed, her jaw was shattered, and her throat slit. She had fought until she couldn't. The defense pointed to his abusive childhood and crack addiction, claiming he acted out of desperation. But the jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty and sentenced to death on April 5, 1989. And after 36 years, a date was finally set, November 20th, 2025. That morning, Richard woke up at 6:30 a.m. Later that day, he was given his final meal, which included a cheeseburger, fries, and ice cream. Richard had one visitor, but did not meet with a spiritual advisor. Just before 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. 3 of the victims' family members sat in the witness room, silent, and waiting for something that had been hanging over their heads for the past 36 years. A prison guard leaned in and asked if he had any last words, but Richard simply said, "No." No apology, no explanation, nothing at all. Moments later, the drugs began to flow. The process moved forward without complications. After a few minutes, the prison staff performed the usual checks, and at 6:12 p.m., Richard was officially pronounced dead. Richard Barry Randolph was 63 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in November. Let's continue with the last month of 2025. The first one was scheduled for December 9th. After spending more than 35 years on death row, Mark Allen Gerald was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? Just after 3:15 p.m. on February 1st, 1989, 8-year-old Bart Pettibone came home and sensed something was wrong. The driveway was empty and the house looked too still. Inside the kitchen, he found a scene he couldn't understand. His mother, 33-year-old Tressa Pettibone, lay bound and bleeding on the floor. Moments later, a family friend arrived with Bart's sister, and one look inside sent her rushing the children back out the door. By the time police arrived, the quiet home had become a crime scene, blood on the floor, a knife rinsed and left in the sink, and signs of a struggle that spoke to a violent fight for survival. Detectives quickly realized that multiple things were missing: jewelry Tressa wore every day, her red Bucci sunglasses, and her car. Yet there were no broken locks, no forced entry. Whoever had walked into that home knew exactly where to go. Their focus soon tightened on a familiar name, 20-year-old Mark Gerald, a carpenter who had worked in the Pettibones' home the year before. A chance meeting at the mall days earlier had given him something he needed: confirmation that Teresa's husband was out of town and a chance to quietly ask Bart when the house was empty each morning. And when Teresa's jewelry began turning up in pawn shops just hours after the murder, with Mark's name on the tickets and blood matching her type on a necklace, the picture became clear. Shoe prints matched his Nikes. Zip ties like those around Teresa's wrists were found in his home and car, and friends said he'd suddenly given away a pair of red sunglasses eerily similar to hers. By February 3rd, police arrested him for murder, robbery, and burglary. In court, the state said his motive was simple: money. He knew Teresa was alone, they argued, and when she resisted, the robbery turned into a killing marked by planning and control. His defense countered with a portrait of a troubled young man who panicked, insisting he hadn't gone there intending to kill, pointing out that the knife came from her own kitchen. But the jury didn't buy it. After only a few hours, they convicted him of first-degree murder, and on April 17, 1990, the judge sentenced Mark Allen Gerald to die in Florida's electric chair. Then, in 2025, the fight was finally over when the Florida Supreme Court signed his death warrant. He was scheduled to die on December 9, 2025. That morning, Mark woke up at 5:45 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Like every inmate facing execution, he was given the option to request a special final meal, but he turned it down. According to the prison spokesperson, no visitors came to see him, and he also chose not to meet with a spiritual advisor. So, in those final hours, Mark Gerald faced the end completely alone, quietly, and with no one by his side. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Mark spoke directly to someone in the viewing room. "I'm sorry that I missed you," he said softly. Then he added, "I loved you every day." No one was sure exactly who he was speaking to, but his words hung in the room with a quiet weight. When the injection began, he took several deep breaths, his chest rising and falling as the drugs took effect. There were a few moments of slight movement, small twitches, his mouth opening and closing. And then he gradually grew still. Within 3 to 4 minutes, Mark showed no further movement. He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Mark Allen Gerald was 58 years old. Just 2 days later, the next execution took place, this time in Tennessee. On December 11, 2025, after spending more than 35 years on death row, Harold Wayne Nichols was executed by lethal injection. Let's take a look at what he did to end up there. It was just before midnight on September 30, 1988, when 28-year-old Harold Wayne Nichols watched a quiet Chattanooga house from the shadows, waiting for one of the roommates to leave. And as soon as she was gone, he grabbed a 2x4 and slipped through a bathroom window. Upstairs, 21-year-old Karen Pulley was asleep, unaware that danger was just seconds away. Wayne crept into her room and attacked without warning, slamming the board into her head. She woke in panic and tried to fight, but he overpowered and her. Then he beat her until she stopped moving, grabbed what he could, and left her bleeding on the floor. A roommate found Karen the next morning, barely clinging to life. She died the next day without ever regaining consciousness. 3 weeks later, Wayne struck again in Tiftonia. A 23-year-old woman had unlocked the side door for her husband, who worked late shifts. And within 15 minutes, Wayne was inside. He grabbed a brass candlestick and attacked her in the bedroom, hitting her until she couldn't resist, and then he raped her. Her husband found her shaking in the dark when he came home. For 3 months, detectives chased dead ends until an anonymous tip on a Thursday night in January 1989 gave them Wayne's name. And within hours, 4 victims identified his photo. Police surrounded his house by 11:06 p.m., and less than an hour after his arrest, the confessions started pouring out. By morning, he had admitted to attacks that hadn't even been reported yet. On camera, he described breaking into Karen's room, attacking her, and leaving her to die. He even led detectives to the vacant lot where he'd ditched the 2x4 that crushed her skull. On May 12, 1990, after just 2 hours, the jury sentenced Harold Wayne Nichols to death, citing the calculated brutality, his lack of remorse, and complete absence of respect for human life. For more than 35 years, he fought to stay alive, but every court saw the same thing: a man who confessed in detail to murder and a string of violent acts. And mercy never came. Instead of mercy, he got a date: December 11, 2025. Like most prisoners on death row, Harold was given the chance to request a final meal. He asked for beef brisket, coleslaw, a baked potato, onion rings, deviled eggs, and cheese biscuits, all washed down with fruit tea. On the morning of December 11, 2025, Wayne was led into the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke calmly and with emotion. "To the people I've harmed, I'm sorry. To my family, know that I love you. To my friends, I love each one of you. I know where I'm going. I'm ready to go home." At 10:25 a.m., the curtain to the witness room opened. Wayne lay on the gurney, wearing a yellow prison suit and his thick black glasses. His arms were stretched out, a sheet pulled neatly to his waist as the medical team completed their preparations. Wayne's sister sat in the witness room, visibly shaken as the process began. His spiritual advisor stood beside him, offering quiet words of comfort. A minute later, the advisor began reading from the Bible. He paused several times, his voice breaking with emotion. Wayne tapped his foot lightly as he listened. By 10:29 a.m., Wayne was nodding and blinking slowly. A minute later, his breathing deepened and grew heavier, causing his mustache to move as the drugs took effect. His breaths gradually slowed, and his face changed in color from red to purple as his body became still. Just minutes later, the blinds closed. At 10:39 a.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Harold Wayne Nichols was 64 years old. Let's continue with the last person executed in 2025. On December 18, 2025, after spending more than 37 years on death row, Frank Athen Walls was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what led him to death row? Let's take a look. It all began in the early morning hours of July 22, 1987, at a mobile home park in Ocean City, Florida. Inside a modest trailer, 22-year-old Edward Alger, an airman stationed at Eglin Air Force Base, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Ann Louise Peterson, were sound asleep. His neighbor, 19-year-old Frank Athen Walls, quietly broke into their home. But he wasn't trying to stay hidden. Once inside, he intentionally knocked over a fan, making just enough noise to wake them up. When Edward and Ann stumbled out to check the noise, they found themselves face to face with an intruder armed with a knife and a gun. Frank forced Ann to tie up Edward's hands and ankles with rope, then did the same to her. But Edward managed to loosen his bindings and lunged at Frank, trying to overpower him. The two men struggled until Frank pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots into Edward's head. Then he raped Ann and shot her twice. Before he left, he grabbed $200 in cash, a worn leather wallet, and the fan as his trophy. Then he walked out, leaving behind 2 bodies and a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. After the news about the murders broke, Frank's roommate called the police and told them to look into him. He had been growing uneasy about Frank's behavior as he had been talking about dark, violent fantasies, raping and killing people recently. The next day, the police arrested Frank. When detectives searched his trailer, they found an arsenal of weapons: ice picks, knives, 9.22 caliber pistols, a hatchet, a chainsaw, burnt boots, and bloody jeans. They also found the stolen fan, wallet, and cash, along with 2 other fans, 4 telephones, and 2 lawnmowers. During questioning, Frank immediately admitted responsibility for the murders. But investigators suspected there was more to the story, and they were right. As they dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Frank had been killing for years. When he was just 17, he killed Tommy Lou Whidden while she was sunbathing on the beach. A year later, on September 16, 1986, he stabbed 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra 21 times and left her body on the side of a road. And just 2 months before the murders on Edward and Ann, he broke into a mobile home and killed 47-year-old Audrey Gigi. After Frank's arrest, investigators found a fan in his trailer with Audrey's fingerprint on it. Frank was sentenced to death for Ann Peterson's murder and life imprisonment with a chance of parole after 25 years for Edward Alger's murder. For many, it felt like the case was finally over. But for Frank, it wasn't. He and his attorneys immediately pushed for a new trial, arguing that earlier hearings about his mental competency had been handled improperly. They spoke about brain damage, a dramatic drop in Frank's IQ after a serious case of meningitis during his teenage years, and deep struggles with basic, everyday functioning. One of the strongest voices supporting Frank's disability claim came from fellow death row inmate Dwayne Owen. Dwayne, who was executed in 2023, lived next to Frank for nearly 30 years and saw his daily struggles up close. He said Frank had trouble reading, understanding basic information, and learning simple tasks. Dwayne also described Frank as confused, often talking to himself and needing constant help to function. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They pointed to earlier testing, noting that when Frank was a minor, he scored an average IQ of 97 across 3 separate tests. And while his score later dropped to an average of 73 as an adult, the state argued that this still did not meet the legal standard for significantly sub-average intellectual functioning. So at first it didn't seem like the argument would go anywhere, but then, unexpectedly, it did. The case made its way to the Florida Supreme Court, and in a surprising turn, the justices agreed. The convictions were thrown out. The court ordered the entire case to be retried, this time in a different city, Mariana, far from the coastal headlines and public outrage that had surrounded the original trial. And just like that, what everyone thought was finished was suddenly wide open again. But even with a new setting and a fresh jury, nothing changed. In July 1992, after hearing all the evidence again, the verdict came back the same: guilty on all counts. Later, the police were looking at Frank for the murder of 35-year-old Lindsay Sams, who had been beaten to death in October 1986. But this time, he refused to say a word. For years, the suspicion hovered. But over time, investigators shifted their attention toward Mark Reeb, the stepfather of Frank's girlfriend at that time. Mark and his brother Alex had already been convicted for killing 29-year-old Donna Callahan in 1989, burying her body in the woods beside their family's property. Not long after Mark started his sentence, he reached out with an unsettling message. He was ready to confess to 12 more murders. But while Lindsay's case remained unsolved, Frank's story was moving toward its end. After decades of trials, retrials, and failed appeals, his time ran out. The legal road he had traveled for years came to a stop. And at last, the state set a date. Frank's execution was scheduled for December 18, 2025. That morning, Frank woke up at 5:10 a.m. and remained calm and compliant throughout the day. For his final meal, he requested chicken, steak, a baked potato, and cheesecake. He later met with one visitor and a spiritual advisor. In the days leading up to his execution, Frank's faith was unshakable. He explained it in simple terms. Either the Lord will grant me a stay and let me live to continue to spread His word, or the Lord will welcome me home. Then the moment came. Frank was strapped to the gurney and asked if he had any final words. He paused, then thanked the execution team for allowing him to speak. "Good evening, everyone," he said. "I appreciate the opportunity to say what's on my heart. If any members of the family are here, I am sorry for all of the things I did, the pain I caused, and all of that you have suffered all these years." Moments later, the process began. A priest stood at his side, holding his hand. Throughout it all, the priest prayed softly. At first, Frank's breathing was heavy, but as time passed, it gradually slowed and grew calm. At 6:11 p.m., a physician entered the room. He checked Frank's eyes, then listened carefully for a heartbeat. After a brief pause, he stepped back and spoke the words that marked the end. The execution had been carried out. Frank Athen Walls was 58 years old. As 2025 came to an end, the numbers told a story that was hard to ignore. Over the course of the year, 47 executions were carried out across the United States. And together, the men who were executed had spent a combined 1,167 years on death row. On average, that came out to 25 years per inmate, a quarter of a century spent waiting for an outcome that in the end was always the same. But one state stood out more than all the others. Florida carried out 19 executions, making it the state with the highest total that year. In doing so, it shattered its own modern record. Until now, Florida's highest number of executions in a single year had been 8 back in 2014. In 2025, that record wasn't just broken, it was more than doubled. The ages of those executed also showed just how wide the spectrum was. The oldest inmate executed was Richard Gerald Jordan, who was 79 years old when he was executed in Mississippi. He had spent 50 years on death row, waiting longer than many people live. At the other end of the spectrum was Blaine Keith Milam. The youngest inmate executed in 2025 was 35 years old. He spent 15 years on death row in Texas before his execution. And while lethal injection remained the most common method, it wasn't the only one used. In 2025, 3 executions were carried out by firing squad, a method rarely seen in modern times, but one that returned to the spotlight in a way few expected. 17 more prisoners had been scheduled for execution in 2025, but those executions never took place. In some cases, their death sentences were reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for most of them, the outcome remains uncertain. They are still on death row, waiting. That concludes all executions carried out in 2025. After hearing these stories, which case stayed with you the most, and why? Let us know in the comments.